Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we explore the complete story of Valeera Sanguinar, the Blood Elf rogue whose life has woven through the shadows of Azeroth's greatest conflicts. Her tale is one of loss and survival, of slavery and freedom, of demonic possession and redemption, and of a loyalty so fierce that it transcends the boundaries of faction and race. Long before Valeera Sanguinar became the trusted spy of kings and the shadow that moved between Horde and Alliance, there existed a kingdom of eternal spring. Quel'Thalas, the homeland of the High Elves, stood as one of the most beautiful and ancient civilizations on all of Azeroth. Its capital city of Silvermoon rose in graceful spires of white stone and living wood, its architecture a testament to 7,000 years of magical refinement and cultural sophistication. The High Elves who dwelt within Quel'Thalas lived lives that other races could only dream of. Their lifespans stretched across millennia, giving them perspectives on time and history that shorter-lived peoples could not comprehend. They had arrived on the shores of the Eastern Kingdoms as exiles from the ancient Night Elven civilization, survivors of the Sundering who had chosen to continue practicing the arcane arts that their kin had forbidden. Over the centuries, they had built something extraordinary from their exile. At the heart of Quel'Thalas lay the Sunwell, a font of magical energy so powerful that it had sustained the High Elven civilization since its founding. The Sunwell had been created from a stolen vial of water from the original Well of Eternity, the source of all arcane magic on Azeroth. Its energies suffused every aspect of High Elven society, feeding their innate magical abilities, extending their already considerable lifespans, and infusing their very beings with arcane potential. The forests of Quel'Thalas were enchanted places where the trees themselves seemed to glow with inner light and the very air sparkled with magical potential. The Eversong woods that surrounded Silvermoon existed in a state of perpetual autumn, their leaves forever golden and crimson, their beauty unchanging across the centuries. Streams of pure water wound through these forests, their courses carefully maintained by elven magic to create landscapes of impossible loveliness. Within this paradise, generations of High Elves had lived in peace and plenty. They studied the arcane arts with the dedication of immortals who had centuries to perfect their craft. They created works of art that would have taken human masters entire lifetimes to complete. They developed magical technologies that allowed them to live in comfort and safety, protected by wards and enchantments that had proven impervious to every threat they had faced. It was into this world of beauty and privilege that Valeera Sanguinar was born. The exact date of her birth has been lost to history, as have many of the details of her early life. What is known is that she was young, very young by elven standards, when her world came crashing down around her. She was still a child when the horrors began, still innocent of the darkness that lurked beyond the magical barriers of her homeland. The Sanguinar family, if their surname indicates their lineage, may have been connected to Lord Sanguinar, a blood elf paladin of some note in later years. Whether this connection is direct or merely coincidental remains unclear, but the name itself suggests a family of some standing within High Elven society. Valeera would later discover that her ancestors included Relfthra, a high elf mage who had been a member of the secret order of Tirisfal, the organization dedicated to combating demonic influence on Azeroth. This heritage, unknown to her as a child, would prove significant in her later life. The Order of Tirisfal had guarded Azeroth against the Burning Legion for thousands of years, its members wielding tremendous power in service of a cause that most of the world never knew existed. That Valeera's blood carried this legacy speaks to a family history intertwined with the great struggles of Azeroth, though she would not learn of this connection until long after her childhood had been stolen from her. In those early years, before the darkness came, Valeera likely lived the life of any high elven child of reasonable standing. She would have begun her education in the magical arts that all high elves were expected to master, would have learned the history and traditions of her people, would have played in the eternal autumn of the Eversong woods without any conception that such beauty could ever be destroyed. The childhood of a high elf in Quel'Thalas was a time of wonder and learning that stretched far longer than the childhoods of shorter-lived races. High elven children were not expected to reach maturity until they had lived for several decades, giving them time to absorb the vast cultural and magical knowledge that their society had accumulated over 7 millennia. Valeera's education, had it proceeded normally, would have included instruction in arcane theory, high elven history, the arts and sciences that her people had perfected over centuries. The structure of high elven education emphasized both individual excellence and service to the collective. Children were taught that their gifts came with responsibilities, that the power they would learn to wield must be used for the benefit of their people. The sunwell that sustained them was a shared resource, a gift from their ancestors that must be protected for future generations. Every high elf was part of something larger than themselves, connected to the past and responsible for the future. The social world of a high elven child would have been filled with relatives, neighbors, and teachers who had known each other for centuries. The close-knit nature of high elven society meant that children grew up surrounded by adults who took an interest in their development, who would notice if they struggled and step in to help. No child was truly alone in Quel'Thalas, at least not before the Scourge came. Valeera's parents, whose names have not been preserved in the historical record, would have been her primary guides through this world. They would have introduced her to the magical traditions of their family, shared the stories that connected her to her ancestors, begun teaching her the skills she would need to take her place in high elven society. They would have loved her, protected her, given her the foundation on which the rest of her life was meant to be built. That foundation would be torn away when the Scourge came. Everything that Valeera's childhood had been building toward, all the assumptions about what her life would contain, all the connections that had seemed as permanent as the sunwell itself, would be destroyed in a matter of days. The child who emerged from that destruction was not the same as the one who had entered it. She never would be. The high elves of Quel'Thalas believed themselves safe. Their magical barriers, the Bun de Noriel or gatekeeper, had stood for millennia, repelling every threat that had been directed against them. The Amani trolls who had once dominated this region had been driven back and contained. The human kingdoms to the south were allies, bound to Quel'Thalas by ancient agreements dating back to the Troll Wars. The world beyond their borders might be dangerous, but within the boundaries of their enchanted kingdom, the High Elves had every reason to believe that they would continue as they always had, immortal and untouchable. That belief, that certainty of eternal safety, would prove to be their greatest vulnerability. The Third War came to Quel'Thalas like a storm of death and corruption that the High Elves were utterly unprepared to face. The Scourge, the undead army created by the Burning Legion to prepare Azeroth for its demonic invasion, swept across the human kingdom of Lordaeron with terrifying speed. Cities fell, populations were slaughtered, and the dead rose to swell the ranks of the invaders. The humans, who had been Quel'Thalas' allies, were destroyed almost overnight, transformed from a buffer state into yet another arm of the undead horde. At the head of this army of corpses rode Arthas Menethil, the former prince of Lordaeron, who had been corrupted by the cursed runeblade Frostmourne. Arthas had once been a paladin, a champion of the light, who had dedicated his life to protecting the innocent. But his desperate quest to save his people from the Scourge's plague had led him down a path of increasingly dark choices, until finally he had become the very thing he had sought to destroy. When Arthas turned his attention to Quel'Thalas, he did so with a specific purpose. The Sunwell, that font of magical energy that sustained the High Elves, could be used to resurrect the Lich Kel'Thuzad, one of the Scourge's most powerful agents. To reach the Sunwell, Arthas would need to break through the magical barriers that protected Quel'Thalas and fight his way to the heart of the High Elven Kingdom. The invasion began at the Thalassian Pass, where the first defenders of Quel'Thalas made their stand against the undead horde. The Ranger General Sylvanas Windrunner led the High Elven forces in a desperate defense, employing every tactic she knew to slow the Scourge's advance. Her rangers harried the undead from the forests, collapsing bridges, contaminating water supplies, doing everything possible to buy time for the evacuation of civilians. But the Scourge was not an enemy that could be stopped by conventional tactics. For every undead that fell, 2 more rose from the bodies of the defenders. The magical barriers that had protected Quel'Thalas for millennia proved inadequate against an enemy that did not tire, did not retreat, and felt no fear. Sylvanas fought brilliantly, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. She was eventually captured by Arthas, and in an act of deliberate cruelty, transformed into a banshee, her soul bound to serve the very army she had died fighting. The Ban Denoriel fell, Silvermoon burned, King Anastarion's Sunstrider, who had ruled Quel'Thalas for nearly 3,000 years, died fighting Arthas at the gates of the city. The Death Knights and Necromancers of the Scourge desecrated everything the High Elves held sacred, slaughtering the defenders and raising them as mindless servants of the Lich King. And then Arthas reached the Sunwell. The corruption of the Sunwell was the final blow to the High Elven civilization. Arthas used its energies to resurrect Kel'Thuzad, transforming the Lich into an even more powerful form and completing his immediate objective. But in doing so, he tainted the very source of High Elven life. The energies that had sustained the High Elves for 7,000 years became corrupted, poisoned by the necromantic magic that had been channeled through them. Those High Elves who survived the Scourge's assault, estimated at no more than 10% of their pre-war population, faced an existence of unimaginable suffering. The destruction of the Sunwell had created a wound that went beyond mere physical damage. Every High Elf was connected to the Sunwell's energies, had been sustained by them since birth. Without that connection, they began to experience withdrawal symptoms that threatened to drive them mad or kill them outright. It was during this period of chaos and destruction that Valeera Sanguinar lost everything. The accounts of exactly how Valeera's family died are incomplete, but what is known suggests a tragedy within a tragedy. While the Scourge was the primary agent of destruction in Quel'Thalas, they were not the only threat that emerged during the chaos. The breakdown of high elven society, the death of so many defenders, and the general collapse of law and order created opportunities for those who preyed on the desperate and the vulnerable. Bandits killed Valeera's family. Whether these were opportunistic criminals who emerged from within high elven society, or outsiders who took advantage of Quel'Thalas's weakness, or some combination of both, the historical record does not specify. What is clear is that Valeera survived, while those who should have protected her did not. She was left alone, a child in a world that had suddenly become unimaginably cruel. The exact circumstances of the attack that killed her family have never been fully revealed. Perhaps Valeera herself does not remember all the details, her young mind having blocked out the most traumatic moments. Perhaps she remembers too well and simply refuses to speak of it. What we can infer from her later behavior is that the experience left deep scars, wounds that would take years to heal and might never fully close. The experience of watching one's family die is transformative in ways that those who have not experienced it cannot fully understand. The child who existed before that moment is effectively destroyed, replaced by something harder, something shaped by trauma and survival instinct. Valeera emerged from her family's death as a different person than she had been, a child forced to grow up too fast, to learn lessons that should never have been hers to learn. The question of why she survived when her family did not is one that likely haunted her for years. Survivor's guilt is a common experience for those who live through events that kill others close to them. Why was she spared? What had she done to deserve life when they had died? These questions have no satisfying answers, but they are asked nonetheless, whispered in the dark hours when sleep will not come and the mind insists on replaying moments that cannot be changed. In Valeera's case, the survival was probably a matter of luck rather than any particular action on her part. She was young, small, perhaps able to hide in places her parents could not reach. Or perhaps the bandits simply missed her, overlooked her in their haste to take what they wanted, and escape before the chaos of the invasion made their own survival impossible. Whatever the reason, she lived, and the weight of that survival would shape everything that followed. The psychological impact of such trauma on a young mind cannot be overstated. Valeera had grown up in a society that had seemed eternal and invincible, had been raised to believe that the magical protections of her homeland would keep her safe from all harm. In the space of days or weeks, she had witnessed the destruction of everything she knew, the death of her entire family, and the transformation of her beautiful homeland into a blasted wasteland. The survivors of Quel'Thalas, those who remained after the Scourge had passed, faced a choice that would define their future identity. Some chose to remain as they were, clinging to their high elven heritage, despite the suffering it caused them. But most, led by Prince Quel'Thas Sunstrider, son of the slain king, chose a different path. They renamed themselves the Sindore, the Children of Blood, in honor of their fallen kin. They would be blood elves, a people defined by their loss and their determination to survive at any cost. Valeera was among those who took this new identity, though her youth meant that she had little choice in the matter. She was a blood elf now, one of a shattered people struggling to survive in the ruins of their civilization. But unlike many of her fellow survivors, she had no one to guide her, no family to protect her, no place within the reconstituting society of Quel'Thalas. She was alone, and she would have to find her own way to survive. The transformation from High Elf to Blood Elf was not merely a change of name. It represented a fundamental shift in how the survivors understood themselves and their place in the world. The High Elves had been a people of tradition, of stability, of confidence in their eternal civilization. The Blood Elves were something different, survivors, pragmatists, people who had learned that nothing was truly safe and that survival required adaptation. For Valeera, this transformation happened without guidance or context. She was too young to have fully internalized the high elven traditions, too isolated to be part of the collective mourning and renewal that the other survivors experienced. She became a blood elf by default, taking on the identity because it was the only one available to her, but without the communal bonds that made that identity meaningful for others. The physical changes that marked the blood elves came gradually. Their eyes, once blue with the light of arcane energy drawn from the sunwell, began to change color as they found other sources of magical sustenance. Many blood elves developed green eyes, a side effect of exposure to fells, energies that became increasingly common as Quel'Thas's teachings about siphoning magic from demons spread through the population. Valeera's eyes took on this emerald hue, marking her visually as one of the Sindore, but the internal changes were more significant than the external ones. The magical addiction that afflicted all blood elves was a constant presence in Valeera's life, a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. Without the sunwell to sustain her, without a structured program for managing her addiction, she was left to cope as best she could with limited resources and no understanding of what was happening to her. The withdrawal symptoms could be severe: lethargy, sweats, aching pain, difficulty focusing. At their worst, they could drive a blood elf to madness or death. Valeera learned to manage these symptoms through sheer force of will, but the struggle was constant and exhausting. Every day was a battle against her own body's demands, a fight for control that never truly ended. The years that followed the destruction of Quel'Thalas were the darkest of Valeera's young life. Without family, without resources, without anyone to care for her, she was forced to rely on her own wits and instincts to survive. She became a thief, stealing what she needed to stay alive, moving through the shadows of a world that had become hostile and unforgiving. The skills she developed during this period would serve her well throughout her life. She learned to move silently, to observe without being observed, to take what she needed and disappear before anyone could catch her. She learned to read people, to identify marks and avoid dangers, to survive in environments where a single mistake could mean death. She was small and young, easily underestimated, and she used this to her advantage whenever possible. The psychology of a street thief is different from that of other criminals. Valeera was not motivated by greed or the thrill of transgression. She Stole because she had no other way to survive, because the alternative was starvation or death from exposure. Every theft was an act of survival, a gamble that the risk was worth the reward. She learned to calculate these risks with cold precision, to identify opportunities that offered maximum benefit with minimum danger. The moral dimension of theft was something Valeera had to grapple with, even as a child. The things she stole belonged to someone, had value to someone, represented work that someone had done, but the alternative was to die, and Valeera was not ready to die. She compartmentalized her guilt, setting it aside in a place where it would not interfere with what she needed to do. She could process the ethics of her situation later, if she survived long enough to have that luxury. The territories through which she moved during these years were varied. She passed through Blood Elf lands, through human settlements, through areas controlled by various factions and groups. Each territory had its own rules, its own dangers, its own opportunities. Valeera learned to adapt to each environment, to blend in wherever she found herself, to become whatever she needed to be to survive. The people she encountered during this period were similarly varied. Some were kind, offering food or shelter to a young elf who seemed lost and alone. Others were cruel, seeing in her vulnerability an opportunity to exploit. She learned to read intentions quickly, to identify threats before they could materialize, to trust her instincts about who was safe and who was dangerous. The loneliness of this period was profound. Valeera had no one to confide in, no one who cared about her well-being, no one who would notice if she disappeared. She was a ghost, moving through a world that did not know she existed, invisible except when she made a mistake. The psychological toll of such isolation on a young mind was significant, shaping her into someone who found it difficult to trust, difficult to open up, difficult to believe that anyone could genuinely care about her. Yet despite this isolation, or perhaps because of it, Valeera developed a fierce sense of self-reliance. She knew that no one was coming to save her, that she was responsible for her own survival. This knowledge was terrifying, but it was also empowering. She would not wait for someone else to determine her fate. She would make her own way, forge her own path, create her own future. The Blood Elves who remained in Quel'Thalas were focused on their own survival, on rebuilding what the Scourge had destroyed, and on finding solutions to the magical addiction that threatened to consume them all. Prince Quel'Thas had led a portion of their population away from the ruined homeland, eventually falling in with Illidan's Stormrage and the forces of Outland. Those who remained worked to cleanse the Sunwell's corruption, to restore the magical infrastructure that had sustained their civilization. In this environment of desperate reconstruction, a young orphan like Valeera would have been just one of many unfortunates. The resources of the Blood Elven people were stretched thin, and while there was undoubtedly sympathy for the many orphans left by the Scourge's destruction, there was little practical ability to care for them all. Valeera slipped through the cracks, becoming part of the shadow economy that exists in any society, but which thrives in times of chaos and desperation. Her thievery took her across the recovering blood elven territories, and eventually beyond. She developed a reputation, though whether that reputation was confined to the criminal underworld or extended to those who enforced whatever laws remained is unclear. What is certain is that she became skilled enough to attempt increasingly ambitious thefts, and skilled enough to survive when those attempts went wrong. It was during one such theft that Valeera's life changed forever. She had targeted a shaman's talisman, an object of sufficient value to justify the risk of stealing from someone with magical abilities. The details of the attempt have not been preserved, but the outcome is clear. Valeera was caught. More than caught, she was captured in a way that demonstrated her fighting ability, even in failure. She injured several guards during her capture, showing a capacity for violence that impressed those who witnessed it. She was imprisoned, awaiting whatever justice the authorities intended to administer. But Valeera had not survived the destruction of her homeland, the death of her family, and years of life on the streets, only to give up when faced with imprisonment. She began planning her escape, working out the details of how she would break free and disappear into the world once again. The day before she intended to implement this plan, everything changed. Rhaegar Earthfury was an orc with an unusual background and an eye for talent. He had been born on Draenor into a clan constantly at war with ogres. As a young orc, he had been captured and forced to fight in ogre training grounds, a brutal existence that he had survived through sheer ferocity. Eventually, he had been sold to orcish arenas, where his fighting skills had made him a champion gladiator. But Rhaegar's days of fighting were behind him. He had become something perhaps even more dangerous, a trainer and owner of gladiators. He ran teams of fighters in the Crimson Ring, a gladiatorial circuit that operated in the shadows of Horde-controlled territories. He had an eye for potential, an ability to identify individuals who had what it took to survive and win in the arenas. When he saw Valeera, he saw that potential. Rhaegar purchased Valeera from her captors, adding her to his stable of gladiators. The blood elf who had survived the Scourge, who had lived by her wits on the streets, who had been caught stealing and had fought her way through her own capture, was exactly the kind of fighter he was looking for. She was young, she was angry, and she had already demonstrated that she would do whatever was necessary to survive. The transaction that made Valeera a gladiator was conducted with the casual indifference of any commercial exchange. She was property now, her value measured in gold, her future determined by someone else's calculations of profit and loss. The freedom she had enjoyed as a street thief, such as it was, had been replaced by a different kind of captivity, one with its own rules and its own possibilities. For Valeera, the change was disorienting. She had spent years relying only on herself, making every decision that affected her life, answering to no one. Now she would take orders, would train when told to train, would fight when told to fight. The independence that had been her identity was suddenly constrained by chains that were not physical, but were no less real for that. Yet there was also something appealing about her new situation, though Valeera would likely not have admitted it at the time. She had been alone for so long, had carried the weight of her survival entirely on her own shoulders. Now there were others who shared that burden, at least in part. Rhaegar, whatever his motives, had an interest in keeping her alive. The other gladiators, whatever their feelings about her, were her teammates, bound to her survival by the same chains that bound her to theirs. The transition from independent thief to owned gladiator forced Valeera to adapt in ways she had not anticipated. The skills that had served her on the streets were valuable in the arena, but they were not sufficient. She needed to learn new techniques, new strategies, new ways of thinking about combat that went beyond simple survival. She needed to become a weapon, honed and directed toward a purpose that was not her own. Valeera's days of stealing for survival were over. She was a gladiator now, a slave who would fight for the entertainment of others. But she was also part of something larger than herself for the first time since her family's death. She was about to meet the companions who would change her life forever. The Crimson Ring was a brutal world where gladiators fought for the entertainment of crowds and the profit of their owners. The fights could be individual or team-based, to the death or merely to submission, but they were always violent and always dangerous. Those who entered the arena knew that each fight might be their last, and this knowledge shaped everything about gladiatorial culture. Rhaegar's team, when Valeera joined it, consisted of two other fighters. The first was Blood-Eye Redfist, an orc warrior whose name spoke to his violent nature and the blood that stained his hands. Blood-Eye was experienced in the ways of the arena, a survivor of countless fights who knew every trick and technique that could give a gladiator an edge. The second was Brawl Baremantle, a night elf, druid who could not have been more different from Valeera in background and temperament. Brawl came from a people who had been at war with the High Elves' ancestors for 10,000 years, whose culture and beliefs were almost entirely opposed to everything the Blood Elves represented. He was a shapeshifter, capable of assuming the forms of various animals, and his druidic magic made him a versatile and dangerous combatant. The pairing of a blood elf and a night elf in the same gladiatorial team would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances. The enmity between their peoples stretched back to the Sundering, to the War of the Ancients, to fundamental disagreements about magic and its proper use that had never been resolved. But in the arena, such considerations were irrelevant. They were all slaves, all property, all tools for their owner's profit. They would work together or they would die. The history between night elves and blood elves was long and bitter. After the war of the ancients and the sundering that followed, the night elves had banned the use of arcane magic, believing that it was the practice of the arcane that had drawn the Burning Legion to Azeroth. Those highborn who refused to accept this ban were exiled, eventually making their way across the sea to found Quel'Thalas and become the High Elves, who would later become the Blood Elves. For 10,000 years, those two elven peoples had remained largely separate. The Night Elves viewed their distant cousins with suspicion, seeing in them the same magical arrogance that had nearly destroyed the world. The High Elves, and later the Blood Elves, viewed the Night Elves as backward and repressive, people who had abandoned the pursuit of knowledge and power in favor of stagnation. Neither side had any interest in reconciliation. Valeera and Brawl were products of this ancient division. Their ancestors had taken opposite sides in the conflict over arcane magic, had made choices that had sent their peoples down divergent paths. By the time they met in the gladiatorial arena, they carried the weight of 10 millennia of estrangement, a history that should have made trust between them impossible. Yet the arena cared nothing for ancient history. The arena demanded survival, and survival demanded cooperation. Valeera and Brawl would either learn to work together or they would die separately. Given those options, the choice was clear. Valeera's role on the team was defined by her skills as a rogue, where Blood Eye was a frontline warrior and Brawl a versatile spellcaster. Valeera was the assassin, the one who struck from the shadows, the trickster whose job was to create openings that her teammates could exploit. It was a role that suited her temperament and her training, drawing on everything she had learned during her years as a street thief. The training was intense and unforgiving. Rhaegar pushed his gladiators hard, knowing that their survival in the arena depended on their preparation outside it. Valeera learned to fight in ways she had never fought before, to work as part of a team rather than as a lone operative, to trust others with her life, even when every instinct told her to rely only on herself. The relationship between Valeera and Brawl was complicated by their racial histories. The Night Elves had exiled the High Elves' ancestors, had condemned them for their continued use of arcane magic, had watched from afar as Quel'Thalas rose and then fell without ever offering aid. There was bad blood between their peoples, resentments that stretched across millennia and could not be easily set aside. But shared hardship has a way of building bonds that transcend old hatreds. Valeera and Brawl were both prisoners, both forced to fight for someone else's benefit, both survivors of their own personal tragedies. Brawl had his own demons to contend with, his own losses and regrets that haunted him. In the crucible of gladiatorial training, they began to develop a mutual respect that would eventually grow into genuine friendship. Blood-Eye Redfist served as a bridge of sorts between the two elves. As an orc, he stood outside the ancient conflicts between their peoples, and his experience in the arena gave him authority that neither of them could challenge. He taught them how to work together, how to anticipate each other's movements, how to function as a unit, rather than as three individuals who happened to be fighting on the same side. The training continued for weeks, perhaps months, as Rhaegar prepared his team for the competitions ahead. Valeera learned the specific tactics that worked best in arena combat, the psychological tricks that could unsettle opponents, the ways to exploit the terrain and the crowd, and the rules of various tournament formats. She became stronger, faster, more deadly than she had ever been as a street thief. And then Blood-Eye Redfist died. The circumstances of his death are not recorded in detail, but the impact on the team was profound. Blood-Eye had been the anchor, the experienced fighter around whom the others organized themselves. His loss left a hole that would need to be filled if the team was to continue competing. The death of a gladiator was not an unusual event. The arenas were designed to produce deaths, to satisfy the crowd's desire to see blood spilled and lives ended. Gladiators who lasted for any length of time knew that their survival was borrowed, that each fight might be their last. Blood-Eye had beaten the odds for longer than most, but eventually the odds had caught up with him. For Valeera, Blood-Eye's death was a reminder of the precariousness of her new life. She had survived the destruction of her homeland, had survived years as a street thief, had survived her capture and enslavement. But none of those survivals guaranteed anything about her future. The arena was indifferent to past achievements, past sufferings, past escapes from death. Each fight was a new chance to die, and Blood-Eye's death proved that even the most experienced gladiators could fall. The grief that Valeera felt was complicated by her relatively new relationship with the fallen orc. She had not known Blood-Eye long, had not developed the deep bond that years of shared experience could create. But she had trained with him, had fought alongside him, had trusted him with her life in the arena. His death was a loss that touched her, even if it was not the devastating blow that her family's death had been. The rituals surrounding a gladiator's death were different from those Valeera had known in Quel'Thalas. The orcs honored their dead through fire, through the ceremonial burning of the body that released the spirit to travel to wherever orc spirits went. Blood-Eye's pyre burned hot and bright, consuming the body of the warrior who had been Valeera's teammate. She watched the flames, feeling the heat on her face, and wondered how many more funeral pyres she would witness before her own death claimed her. After Blood-Eye's funeral pyre, Brawl told Valeera the stories of both Rhaegar and Blood-Eye, sharing the history of their owner and their fallen teammate. It was a moment of connection between the two elves, a recognition that they were now bound together more closely than before. Without Blood-Eye, they would need to rely on each other even more heavily. The replacement for Blood-Eye came in an unexpected form. While being transported to Orgrimmar in a caged wagon, Valeera and Brawl encountered a new addition to their team, a human who had washed up on the shore with no memory of who he was or where he came from. The amnesiac human who joined Valeera and Brawl's gladiatorial team was a mystery from the moment of his arrival. He had been found on the seashore, unconscious and alone, with no identification and no memory of his past life. He knew how to fight, his body remembering combat techniques that his conscious mind had forgotten, but he could not recall anything about his identity, his history, or how he had come to be in such a state. Rhaegar saw potential in this stranger, just as he had seen potential in Valeera. The human's muscle memory suggested extensive martial training, and his physical conditioning indicated that he had been a warrior of some considerable skill. Whatever his past might be, his present utility was obvious. He would join the team as their new frontline fighter, replacing the fallen Blood-Eye Redfist. The chemistry between the three gladiators developed in ways that none of them could have predicted. Valeera, who had learned to trust no one during her years as a street thief, found herself gradually opening up to her new teammates. Brawl's calm wisdom provided a counterbalance to her own fierce independence, while the human's natural leadership gave their group a cohesion it had lacked under Blood-Eye's more aggressive approach. The training regimen that Rhaegar imposed on his gladiators was brutal but effective. Dawn began with physical conditioning, running and climbing and lifting until muscles burned and lungs screamed for rest. Then came weapons practice, hours of drilling with blades and staves and whatever other implements the arena might provide. Tactical exercises followed, scenarios designed to teach the gladiators how to work together, how to cover each other's weaknesses, how to exploit the gaps that opponents inevitably left. Rhaegar's methods drew on his own experience as a former gladiator, on techniques he had learned during his years in the arena and refined during his time as an owner. He knew that raw skill was not enough to survive gladiatorial combat. What separated champions from corpses was the ability to think under pressure, to adapt when plans failed, to find victory in situations that seemed hopeless. He drilled these lessons into his slaves relentlessly, accepting nothing less than perfection. For Valeera, this structured training was different from anything she had experienced before. Her survival skills had been learned haphazardly, picked up through trial and error on the streets. Rhaegar's systematic approach revealed gaps in her abilities that she had not known existed, weaknesses that could have killed her in different circumstances. She absorbed his lessons eagerly, recognizing that the knowledge he offered could keep her alive. The human, for his part, seemed drawn to protect the young blood elf. Despite his lack of memories, his instincts told him that she was younger than she appeared, more vulnerable than she pretended to be, more in need of protection than she would ever admit. He watched out for her during training, positioned himself to cover her weaknesses in mock combat, and gradually became the closest thing to family that Valeera had known since her parents' deaths. Brawl observed this developing dynamic with the perspective of someone who had seen much and learned patience through suffering. The night elf druid had his own demons to contend with, his own losses that haunted him. But he recognized in both of his teammates people who were searching for something, people who needed connection as much as they needed combat skills. He became the steady presence that held their group together, the voice of reason when emotions ran high. The three of them, 2 elves and an amnesiac human, trained together in the Ring of Valor. It was an unlikely combination, a team that should not have worked, but somehow did. The human, despite his lack of memories, proved to be an exceptional combatant, his instincts guiding him through fights with a precision that impressed even Rhaegar. Valeera and Brawl adjusted their tactics to work with their new teammate, and slowly the three of them became a cohesive unit. Valeera's initial impressions of the human are not recorded, but she likely viewed him with the same wary pragmatism that had kept her alive for years. He was a tool, a teammate, someone whose skills would help her survive the arena. That he had no memory of his past was curious, but ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was that he could fight, and fight he could. The bond between the three gladiators deepened as they trained and fought together. They learned to trust each other with their lives, because in the arena, that trust was not optional. A moment's hesitation, a failure to support a teammate, could mean death for all of them. The crucible of combat forged connections that transcended their differences in race and background. The human proved to be more than just a skilled fighter. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed of natural leadership qualities that made him a focal point for the team. When they fought, the others instinctively looked to him for direction, following his tactical decisions without conscious thought. It was as if some essential quality of command had survived in him even when his specific memories had been stripped away. Rival gladiators tested themselves against the novice team, as was common in the gladiatorial world. These fights to the death served both as entertainment for their owners and as a winnowing process, eliminating weak teams before they could embarrass anyone at the major tournaments. Valeera, Brawl, and their mysterious human teammate survived these tests, killing their opponents and strengthening their reputation. When the time came for the major competition, Rhaegar took his team to Dire Maul. This ancient night, elven ruin in Quel'Thalas, had been converted into one of the premier gladiatorial venues in the Horde-controlled territories. The tournament held there attracted the best teams and the biggest crowds, and victory there could make reputations and fortunes. The journey to Dire Maul was an adventure in itself. The three gladiators, though still technically slaves, were valuable property now, and Rhaegar protected his investment by ensuring they traveled with reasonable comfort and security. Valeera saw parts of Azeroth but she had never seen before, landscapes completely different from the forests of Quel'Thalas or the territories where she had lived as a thief. At Dire Maul, the competition was fierce. Teams from across the gladiatorial circuit had gathered to compete for the championship, each one determined to prove their superiority. The fights were brutal and bloody, the crowds bloodthirsty and demanding. In the ancient arena, surrounded by the ruins of a civilization far older than any of those present, gladiators killed and died for the entertainment of the masses. Dire Maul itself was a fascinating location, an ancient night elven city that had fallen into ruin and been claimed by various groups over the centuries. The arena that had been constructed within its walls drew on the architectural grandeur of the original city, creating a setting that was both beautiful and terrible. The stone seats that surrounded the fighting floor had once been places where night elves gathered for purposes far different from watching slaves kill each other. The format of the tournament was elimination style, with teams fighting multiple matches until only one remained. The early rounds were intended to weed out the weaker teams, those who had made it to the tournament but lacked the skill or luck to advance further. As the rounds progressed, the remaining teams became increasingly dangerous, survivors who had proven their worth through blood and violence. Valeera's team faced challenges at every stage. Some opponents relied on brute force, trying to overwhelm them with sheer power. Others employed tricks and tactics designed to exploit weaknesses. Still others fought with the desperation of those who knew that defeat meant death. Each match required different strategies, different approaches, different ways of applying their combined skills. The human who would become known as Logosh proved himself repeatedly as the tournament progressed. His combat abilities were extraordinary, his instincts seemingly perfect, his stamina apparently inexhaustible. He fought as if he had been born for the arena, as if killing was as natural to him as breathing. The crowds noticed, their admiration growing with each victory. But it was not just Logosh who distinguished himself. Brawl's druidic abilities gave the team flexibility that other groups could not match, his shape-shifting allowing him to adapt to whatever the situation demanded. And Valeera's rogue skills proved essential for dealing with opponents who were too dangerous to face head-on, for exploiting momentary weaknesses, for turning the tide of battles that seemed lost. Valeera, Brawl, and their human teammate fought through the brackets with a combination of skill, teamwork, and luck that their opponents could not match. They exploited weaknesses, adapted to challenges, and survived situations that should have killed them. The human's combat abilities seemed almost supernatural in their precision, his body remembering techniques and tactics that his mind had forgotten. The final battle of the tournament was their greatest challenge. Against opponents who had also fought their way through the competition, who were also desperate and determined and deadly, the three gladiators gave everything they had. And in the end, they emerged victorious, the champions of the Dire Maul tournament. The crowd gave the human a name that day. They called him Logosh, which meant ghost wolf in the Orcish tongue. It was a name that spoke to his ferocity in combat, to his seemingly supernatural abilities, to the mystery of his unknown origins. He was the ghost wolf, and he had led his team to victory. Valeera, standing beside her teammates in the aftermath of their triumph, had no idea that she had just helped crown the lost king of Stormwind. The celebration that followed the tournament victory was intense but brief. Gladiators who had survived the grueling competition were feted by their owners, praised by the crowds, and given the temporary privileges that came with championship status. The wine flowed freely that night, and even Rhaegar seemed pleased enough to allow his slaves some measure of relaxation after their triumph. But the morning after brought the return of reality. They were still slaves, still property, still subject to the decisions of those who owned them. The glory of victory did not change the fundamental reality of their situation. The championship title that Logosh had earned, the reputation that all three of them now possessed, these were assets that belonged to Rhaegar, not to them. They had fought and bled and nearly died, and the primary beneficiary was the orc who had bought them. For Valeera, the victory was bittersweet. She had proven herself in the most demanding arena on Azeroth, had demonstrated that the young blood elf, who had been sold into slavery, was capable of standing against the most dangerous opponents the gladiatorial world could offer. But that proof meant nothing in terms of her freedom. She was still owned, still controlled, still subject to the whims of Rhaegar Earthfury and whatever plans he might have for her. The bonds that had formed between herself, Brawl, and Logosh during the tournament were real and powerful. They had fought together, protected each other, survived situations that should have killed them. The three of them understood each other in ways that people who had not shared such experiences could never understand. They were more than teammates now. They were family, in the truest sense of the word, that Valeera had known since the death of her parents. The elation of victory gave way to the reality of what came next. Rhaegar had decisions to make about his championship team, about how to capitalize on their success, about how to maximize the return on his investment. In their training and survival, the gladiators themselves had no say in these decisions. They could only wait and see what their owner would do. The victory at Dire Maul should have been a beginning, the start of a lucrative career as championship gladiators. But even as they celebrated their triumph, Rhaegar was already planning his next move. The team's value had never been higher, and the orc slave master intended to capitalize on this. Rhaegar sold Valeera to Helka Grimtotem, a gladiator mistress who ran her own stable of fighters. The price was reported to be 2,000 gold pieces, a substantial sum that reflected Valeera's proven abilities in the arena. It was a purely business decision for Rhaegar, a conversion of asset into currency, but for Valeera, it was a betrayal. She had been sold before, when she was first purchased from her captors, but that had been different. She had not yet formed connections with anyone, had not yet learned to trust. Now she was being separated from the teammates she had fought beside, the companions who had become as close to family as she had known since her parents' death. The bonds forged in the arena were being broken by the cold logic of commerce. Helka Grimtotem had plans for her new acquisition, intending to use Valeera in exhibition games on the Merchant Coast. But Valeera had other ideas. She was not the same desperate street thief who had been captured while stealing a shaman's talisman. She had trained with the best, had fought in the most demanding arenas, had become a warrior as well as a rogue, and she had absolutely no intention of remaining a slave. Her escape was aided by a wyvern named Bristlefur. The exact circumstances of how she obtained the creature's assistance are unclear, but the result was decisive. Valeera broke free from Helka Grimtotem's custody and took to the skies, leaving her would-be owner behind and setting out to find her former teammates. The sensation of flying on a wyvern was unlike anything Valeera had experienced before. The wind rushing past her, the world spread out below like a map, the feeling of freedom that came from being above the constraints of the earth, all of it was exhilarating and terrifying at once. She was not an experienced rider, had never had the opportunity to learn such skills, but Bristlefur seemed to understand what she needed and carried her faithfully toward her destination. The flight gave her time to think, time to process everything that had happened since she had become a gladiator. She had been a street thief, surviving on her wits and her willingness to take what she needed. Then she had become property, trained to fight for the entertainment of others. She had formed bonds with teammates she had never expected to care about, had won championships that should have been beyond her reach, and now she was an escaped slave, a fugitive, flying through the air on a creature that had no reason to help her. The journey also gave her time to consider what she was doing and why. She was risking everything to reunite with Brawl and Logosh, people she had known for a relatively short time. She could have used this escape to disappear entirely, to find some remote corner of Azeroth where no one knew her name and start a new life. Instead, she was heading back toward the people who represented both her chains and her freedom, the teammates who had become her chosen family. The decision said something important about who Valeera had become. She was no longer the isolated survivor who trusted no one and relied only on herself. The connections she had formed in the arena had changed her, had made her someone who valued relationships over security, who was willing to take risks for the sake of people she cared about. The street thief who had arrived in Rhaegar's custody would not have made this choice. The gladiator champion who escaped from Helka Grimtotem did. Brawl and Logosh had also escaped from Rhaegar Earthfury, though their escape had taken a different form. They had left together, apparently deciding that their partnership was worth more than their obedience to their owner. When Valeera found them, it was a reunion of survivors, of gladiators who had chosen freedom over the certainty of continued enslavement. The three of them were fugitives now, escaped slaves who could be recaptured and punished if they were caught. But they were also free, at least temporarily, and they had each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. It was during this period that they encountered Egwin, the former guardian of Tirisfal. Egwin had been the most powerful mortal magic user of her age, wielder of the Guardian's power for nearly 1,000 years before passing it to her son, Medivh. She had fought and defeated the avatar of Sargeras himself, though that victory had planted the seeds of later tragedy. Now ancient and diminished, she was, nonetheless, a figure of tremendous importance in the cosmic struggle against the Burning Legion. Egwin recognized something in Logosh that the gladiator himself did not understand. With her help, and that of Jaina Proudmoore, the ruler of Theramore, they were able to begin dispelling the dark magics that blocked Logash's memories. Slowly, piece by piece, the human's true identity began to emerge. He was Varian Wrynn. He was the king of Stormwind, and he had been missing for years, presumed dead after an apparent assassination during a diplomatic mission to Theramore. The Ghost Wolf, the gladiator champion, the amnesiac warrior who had fought beside Valeera and Brawl in the Crimson Ring, was the ruler of one of the most powerful human kingdoms on Azeroth. The implications of this discovery rippled through everything Valeera thought she understood about her situation. The man she had trained beside, fought beside, trusted with her life, was not merely a skilled warrior with no past. He was a king, one of the most powerful leaders on Azeroth, a figure whose disappearance had created political chaos and whose return would reshape the balance of power across the continent. For Valeera, the revelation added new dimensions to her relationship with Varian. She had come to care for him as a friend, as a teammate, as the closest thing to family she had known in years. Now she learned that he was also a figure of tremendous political importance, someone whose well-being mattered to far more than just those who knew him personally. The personal had become political in ways that would define the rest of her life. The revelation also complicated her own position. She was a blood elf, a member of a race that had recently joined the Horde, the faction that was politically opposed to Stormwind and the alliance it led. Her friendship with Varian, formed in the neutrality of the gladiatorial arena, now existed in a context of factional conflict. What did it mean for a blood elf to be bound by ties of loyalty to the King of Stormwind? What did it mean for her own identity as Sindore? These questions would take years to fully answer, if they could be answered at all. For the moment, the immediate priority was clear. They had to get Varian back to his kingdom, had to restore him to his rightful throne, had to undo whatever harm had been done during his absence. The complications could be addressed later. First, they had to reach Stormwind. The revelation was stunning. Valeera had fought alongside a king without ever knowing it. She had trusted her life to him, and he had trusted his to her, without either of them understanding the true significance of their partnership. The bond that had formed between them in the arena had been real, but its context was completely different from what any of them had believed. Together, the group journeyed toward Stormwind, intending to restore Varian to his rightful throne, but the journey would prove far more dangerous than any of them anticipated. The voyage across the Great Sea was necessary to reach the eastern kingdoms, where Stormwind lay waiting for its true king. Valeera, Brawl, and the newly recovered Varian boarded a ship that would carry them toward their destination, hopeful that the hardest parts of their journey were behind them. They were wrong. The attack came without warning. Naga, the serpentine former night elves who had been transformed by the old gods eons ago, emerged from the depths to assault their vessel. These were not random predators, but organized attackers, led by a sea witch of considerable power. The battle was fierce and desperate, the defenders fighting for their lives against creatures who were perfectly adapted to maritime combat. Valeera fought with all the skill she had developed in the arenas, but this was different from gladiatorial combat. The deck of a ship was not an arena floor, and Naga were not gladiators fighting by rules. The Sea Witch's magic added another dimension of danger, arcane energies crackling through the air as she attacked the defenders with spell after spell. In the chaos of the battle, something happened that would shape the rest of Valeera's life. The Sea Witch wielded a trident that was infused with arcane energy, and during their confrontation, Valeera absorbed some of that energy into herself. Whether this was intentional on her part, an accident of combat, or some quirk of magical interaction is unclear. What is certain is that the absorption of this arcane power awakened something within her. The Blood Elves, like their high elven ancestors before them, had an innate connection to magical energy. For 7,000 years, the Sunwell had provided the High Elves with a constant supply of arcane power that their bodies and spirits had come to depend upon. When the Sunwell was corrupted during the Scourge invasion, that connection was severed, leaving the survivors with what amounted to a physical addiction to magic that could no longer be satisfied. Valeera had been young when the Sunwell fell, young enough that she might have escaped the worst of this addiction. But the absorption of the Sea Witch's arcane energy changed that. It was as if she had taken a drug that she had not previously been dependent on, and now her body craved more. She had become addicted to magical energy, a condition that would plague her for years to come. The ship survived the Naga attack, reaching port in the eastern kingdoms. But Valeera was changed by the experience. She now carried within her a hunger for magic that would influence her decisions and her behavior in ways she could not fully control. The arcane addiction that afflicted so many blood elves had found a new victim. From the coast, the group traveled inland, their destination the city of Ironforge in the Cosmodan Mountains. Their route took them through lands that were theoretically friendly to Varian and his cause, but the true king's return was not universally welcomed. There were forces at work in Azeroth that preferred Varian Wrynn to remain lost, forces that would kill to keep their secrets hidden. The ambush came near Menethil Harbor. A blood elf warlock named Vendalin Soulfire attacked the group, specifically targeting Valeera. He had been sent by Katrana Prester, the mysterious noblewoman who served as regent in Stormwind during Varian's absence. Katrana was, in fact, the black dragon Onyxia in human disguise, and she had been responsible for Varian's disappearance in the first place. Vendalin did not simply try to kill Valeera. Instead, he placed a magical mark upon her, the marks of Cathranatir. This mark established a connection between Valeera and a powerful dreadlord, a demon of the Burning Legion, who had been the ancient enemy of the Council of Tirisfal. Through this mark, Cathranatir was able to begin possessing Valeera, his demonic essence seeping into her mind and body. The possession was not immediate or complete. Cathranatir's influence grew gradually, taking advantage of Valeera's weakened state and her magical addiction. The fell energies of the demon exacerbated her craving for magic, making her addiction even more severe. And during moments when her self-control slipped, the demon would take control of her body, using it for his own purposes. Valeera now faced two threats that were intimately connected. Her addiction to magic made her vulnerable to the demon's influence, and the demon's influence made her addiction worse. It was a vicious cycle that threatened to consume her entirely, to transform her from a person into a puppet controlled by one of the most dangerous beings in the cosmos. The Dreadlords, of which Quel'Thalas was one, were among the most cunning and manipulative demons in the Burning Legion. Unlike the brutish Felguards or the mindless Infernals, Dreadlords specialized in psychological warfare, in breaking down their victims' resistance through manipulation rather than force. They were patient, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in their pursuit of control. Quel'Thalas had a particular history with Azeroth. He had been an enemy of the Council of Tirisfal for as long as that organization had existed, a persistent threat that the Guardians and their allies had combated across millennia. His mark upon Valeera was not merely a tool of possession, but a symbol of the eternal conflict between the forces of order and the Burning Legion's chaos. The mechanics of the possession were insidious. Quel'Thalas did not simply take control of Valeera's body. Instead, he worked to erode her will, to wear down her resistance until she would surrender to him willingly. He used her magical addiction as a weapon against her, feeding her fell energies that satisfied her craving while simultaneously strengthening his hold on her soul. Every time she accepted his power, every time she gave in to the hunger, she lost a little more of herself. The experience of demonic possession was horrifying. Quel'Thalas used psychological torture to weaken Valeera's resistance, conjuring visions of her deceased parents and using their images to verbally abuse her. He played on her feelings of abandonment, her grief over her lost family, her insecurities about her place in the world. Every moment of weakness was an opportunity for him to tighten his grip on her soul. But Valeera was not easily broken. She had survived the destruction of her homeland, the death of her family, years of life as a street thief, and the brutal world of gladiatorial combat. She was a fighter, and she fought the demon's influence with every ounce of strength she possessed. The battle was internal, invisible to those around her, but it was as real and as desperate as any she had ever fought in the arena. The group continued their journey despite Valeera's condition, eventually reaching Stormwind City. The journey had been difficult, marked by attacks from enemies who seemed to know their movements, by Valeera's ongoing struggle against the demon's influence, by the tensions that arose when people with different backgrounds and abilities were forced to work together under pressure. For Valeera, the journey through the Eastern Kingdoms was an education in Alliance territory. She had never spent significant time in human lands before, had never experienced the culture and customs of the nations that would become her adopted home. Everything was different from what she had known in Quel'Thalas or during her time as a thief in Blood Elf territory. The architecture, the food, the attitudes of the people, all of it was foreign and sometimes disorienting. The presence of the demon inside her added another layer of alienation. She was not merely a blood elf among humans, but a possessed blood elf, a potential threat even to those who were trying to help her. The mark of Quel'Thalas was not always visible, but those with magical sensitivity could detect its presence, could sense the demonic taint that clung to her soul. Some looked at her with pity, others with fear, and still others with the cold calculation of those who were wondering whether she might need to be eliminated for the safety of others. Brawl and Varian stood by her throughout these difficulties. They had seen what she was going through, had witnessed her struggles against the demon's influence, and they refused to abandon her despite the risks she represented. Their loyalty was tested repeatedly during the journey, as Valeera's control slipped and Catherine Notter's influence surfaced in unexpected ways, but they remained committed to her welfare. The countryside through which they traveled bore the scars of past conflicts. The plague lands to the north were still blighted by the Scourge's passage, their corruption visible even from a distance. The Arathi Highlands showed signs of the ongoing tensions between the various groups that claimed the region. Everywhere they looked, there were reminders that Azeroth was a world at war, a place where peace was the exception rather than the rule. But what they found there was not a kingdom waiting eagerly for its king's return. Instead, they discovered a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the realm's power structure. Onyxia, in her guise as Katrana Prester, had ruled Stormwind as regent during Varian's absence, but she had done more than simply hold power in his name. She had actually split Varian into two beings using dark magic, creating a duplicate that she could control while the original was sold into slavery with his memories erased. The Varian who had been ruling Stormwind was not the true king, but a weakened shadow of him, dominated by Onyxia's influence. When the real Varian arrived in the capital, the confrontation that followed exposed Onyxia's true nature. The Black Dragon was forced to reveal herself, abandoning her human disguise to fight as the massive creature she truly was. The battle that followed was one of the most dramatic in Stormwind's history. A dragon rampaging through the streets of the capital while heroes fought to stop her. Valeera participated in this conflict, despite the demon fighting for control of her body. She stood with Varian against the dragon, who had orchestrated his disappearance, who had manipulated his kingdom in his absence, who had sent the warlock who had marked her for demonic possession. It was a complicated situation, made even more complicated by her internal struggle, but she refused to abandon her friend when he needed her most. Onyxia was eventually defeated and killed, her conspiracy exposed, and her machinations brought to an end. Varian, now whole once more as his two halves were reunited, reclaimed his throne as the rightful king of Stormwind. The long nightmare of his absence was over, and the kingdom could begin to recover from the damage Onyxia had done. For Valeera, however, the nightmare was not over. She still carried the mark of Catherine Nottir, still fought against the demon's influence, still struggled with the magical addiction that made her so vulnerable to his power. The victory over Onyxia had not freed her from her own demons, both literal and metaphorical. The battle for the Undercity came not long after. The Forsaken, the faction of free-willed undead who had broken from the Scourge, had been betrayed from within. A group of Forsaken, led by Grand Apothecary Putris, had developed a new plague and used it against both Horde and Alliance forces at the Battle of the Wrathgate. They had then seized control of the Undercity, the Forsaken capital, forcing the Horde to mount an assault to reclaim it. Varian led an Alliance force in a parallel assault on the Undercity, intending to strike at the treasonous Forsaken and perhaps to deal a blow to the Horde at the same time. Valeera accompanied him, as did Brawl Baremantle and the Archmage Jaina Proudmoore. Together, they fought their way into the depths of the Undercity, battling through demons and plague-twisted abominations to reach the heart of the conspiracy. The assault was successful in defeating Putris and the forces that had seized control of the Undercity. But as the Alliance and Horde forces converged in the aftermath, a confrontation between the factions seemed inevitable. Varian, his rage against the Horde, stoked by years of suffering and recent betrayals, seemed ready to start a war right there in the heart of Undercity. Jaina Proudmoore intervened. Using her magic, she froze both Varian and Valeera, along with Brawl and the other Alliance forces, preventing them from attacking the Horde leadership. She then teleported the frozen group back to Stormwind, diffusing the immediate crisis, but leaving tensions between the factions higher than ever. For Valeera, this incident demonstrated the awkwardness of her position. She was a blood elf, technically a member of a race that belonged to the Horde. Yet she fought alongside the King of Stormwind, participated in an assault on a Horde capital, and would have engaged in combat against her own people if Jaina had not intervened. Her loyalty was to Varian personally, not to the Alliance or its causes, but that distinction could be difficult to maintain when swords were drawn and blood was being shed. The struggle against Quel'Thalas came to a head during the efforts to rescue Medon, the son of Medivh and the half-orc Garona. Medon had been captured by Cho'Gall, the two-headed ogre mage who served the old gods, and taken to the ruins of Ankiraj. Valeera partnered with Merrill Fellstorm, an undead mage who was one of the few survivors of the original Council of Tirisfal, to mount a rescue. The journey to Ankiraj was dangerous, and what they found there was even more dangerous. Medon was being held near the dead body of S'thun, the old god whose defeat had been one of the great victories of recent Azerothian history. Cho'Gall intended to use the boy for some dark purpose connected to his old godmasters. Valeera and Merrill managed to free Medon from his prison, but their escape was intercepted by Cho'Gall himself. The two-headed ogre was one of the most powerful practitioners of dark magic on Azeroth, a being whose connection to the old gods gave him strength that few could match. Merrill was struck down with a single blow, leaving Valeera to face Cho'Gall alone. She absorbed magical energy from both Merrill and Medon, trying to gather enough power to fight back against their enemy. But Cho'Gall was simply too strong. Her attacks, enhanced though they were, could not overcome his defenses. She was going to lose, and losing meant that all three of them would die in the ruins of Ankiraj. In that desperate moment, Valeera made a terrible choice. She stopped fighting against Quel'Thalas's influence. Instead, she willingly surrendered control to the demon, offering herself to him in exchange for the power to defeat Cho'Gall. It was a deal with a devil, a sacrifice of her autonomy for the strength she needed to save her companions. The decision was not made lightly. Valeera knew what she was giving up, understood the implications of fully surrendering to the demon she had been fighting for so long. But the alternative was to watch Medon and Merrill die, to fail the people who were counting on her, to prove that the demon's persistent whispers about her worthlessness were true. In the end, the choice was between her freedom and their lives. She chose their lives. The philosophy of self-sacrifice runs throughout Warcraft's narratives, and Valeera's decision to surrender to Quel'Thalas fits into this larger pattern. Characters who care about others, who form genuine connections despite the dangers of the world they inhabit, are repeatedly called upon to sacrifice themselves for those they love. Valeera's sacrifice was particularly poignant because it was not physical death she risked, but something potentially worse: the permanent loss of her identity, her free will, her very self. The moment of surrender was also a moment of trust. By giving herself to Quel'Thalas, Valeera was implicitly trusting that her companions would find a way to save her, that the sacrifice would not be permanent. She was betting her soul on the bonds she had formed, on the belief that Meryl and Medon would not abandon her to demonic possession. It was a gamble born of desperation, but also of faith in the relationships she had built. The demon accepted. With Quel'Thalas's full power flowing through her, Valeera attacked Cho'Gall with a ferocity that drove the ogre back. The fell energies she now wielded were enough to match his old god-enhanced magic, at least for a time. The confrontation bought the crucial seconds they needed. Meryl, recovering from Cho'Gall's attack, saw what was happening. He understood that Valeera had given herself to the demon, that she was now possessed in the fullest sense of the word, and he made his own choice. Meryl Fellstorm offered himself to Quel'Thalas, taunting the demon about his abilities, presenting himself as a more attractive vessel than the blood elf the demon currently inhabited. It was a deliberate gambit, a trap disguised as an opportunity. Quel'Thalas, perhaps overconfident after his successful possession of Valeera, took the bait. He left Valeera's body and entered Meryl's instead. The moment of transition was both terrifying and liberating for Valeera. One instant, she was submerged beneath the demon's will, her own consciousness pushed to the margins of her own mind. The next, she was herself again, the demonic presence that had been her constant companion suddenly absent. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the horror of what she had nearly become. She collapsed, her body weakened by the ordeal, her mind struggling to process the sudden freedom after months of psychological warfare. The battle against Cho'Gall continued around her, but for those brief moments, she could only lie on the stone floor of Ankiraj and try to remember what it felt like to be truly alone in her own head. The sensation was strange and wonderful. For so long, there had been another voice whispering in the back of her mind, another will pressing against her own. Quel'Thalas had never been silent, never stopped trying to break her down, never given her a moment's peace. Now the silence was almost deafening, a void where the demon had been. But Meryl was not an ordinary mage. He was undead, ancient, and possessed of techniques and wards that had been developed specifically to contain demonic power. Once Quel'Thalas was inside him, Meryl was able to trap the demon, containing him within his own body where he could be controlled and subdued. The dreadlord who had tormented Valeera was now a prisoner, forced to serve Meryl's purposes rather than his own. Valeera was free. The demon that had possessed her, that had amplified her addiction and tortured her with visions of her dead parents, that had threatened to consume her entirely, was gone. The mark of Quel'Thalas remained on her body, a scar that she would carry for the rest of her life, but its power over her was broken. The experience left Valeera changed in ways that went beyond the physical. She had faced demonic possession and survived. She had made the terrible choice to surrender to evil and had been rescued from the consequences of that choice. She understood, perhaps better than most, how thin the line was between survival and damnation, how easily a desperate person could fall into darkness. But she had also learned something about herself. She had friends, people who cared enough about her to risk everything to save her. Meryl had sacrificed his own freedom. accepting a demon into his body to free her from Quel'Thala's control. That was not something you did for a mere acquaintance or a convenient ally. That was something you did for someone you truly valued. The resolution of the demon possession marked a turning point in Valeera's story. She was no longer just a survivor, a former slave, a gladiator trying to find her place in a confusing world. She was someone who had been tested by cosmic forces and had emerged, if not unscathed, then at least still herself. The foundation for her future role had been laid. The aftermath of the possession was complicated. Though Quel'Thala was no longer inside her, the experience had left marks that could not be easily erased. The mark itself remained on her body, a visible reminder of what she had endured. More significantly, the psychological scars of having her mind invaded, of being used as a puppet, of being tortured with images of her dead parents would linger for years. The resurgence of her magical addiction was another consequence that she would have to manage. Brawl Baremantle, who had observed her closely during and after the possession, noted that her use of FL magic during the fight against Cho'Gall might have intensified her cravings. The same power that had saved their lives might have set back her recovery from addiction, creating new struggles that she would have to overcome. But Valeera was not one to dwell on her problems. She had always been someone who focused on the next challenge, the next obstacle, the next thing that needed to be done. The demon was contained, her friends were safe, and there was work to be done. She would deal with her lingering issues as they arose, as she had dealt with every other challenge in her life. The experience had also given her a unique perspective on demonic corruption. She understood from the inside how the Legion worked to subvert and control its victims. She knew the tactics Quel'Thala had used, the ways he had tried to break her down, the vulnerabilities he had exploited. This knowledge would prove valuable in the years to come, as she continued to operate in the shadows of a world where demonic threats were all too common. With the demon contained and Valeera freed from its influence, she could finally consider what came next. Varian had offered her a position in Stormwind after reclaiming his throne, recognizing the debt he owed to the Blood Elf who had fought beside him through so much. Now, with her immediate crisis resolved, Valeera was able to accept that offer. But she did so with a condition that reflected the complex nature of her loyalties. She would serve Varian as an advisor and bodyguard. She would not serve the Alliance. Her loyalty was personal to Varian Wrynn and his son Anduin, not to the faction they led. She was a blood elf, a Sindori, and she would not pretend to be anything else. She would not turn her back on her people or their choices, even as she worked for a human king. It was an unusual arrangement, perhaps unique in the history of Alliance-Horde relations. A blood elf, a member of a race that officially belonged to the Horde, serving as a trusted confidant to the High King of the Alliance. Valeera walked between worlds, belonging fully to neither, trusted by both because of her personal integrity rather than any factional loyalty. She became Varian's spy, his shadow, the one who gathered intelligence and performed tasks that required discretion rather than brute force. Her skills as a rogue, honed first on the streets of Quel'Thalas and then in the gladiatorial arenas, were perfectly suited to this role. She could move through places where others could not go, learn things that others could not discover, and act when more obvious approaches would fail. The position also gave her a relationship with the young Prince Anduin Wrynn. While Varian was the king, the powerful warrior who commanded armies and made decisions that shaped nations, Anduin was still growing into his role. He was idealistic, compassionate, and possessed of a wisdom beyond his years. But he was also young and sometimes needed guidance that his father could not provide. Valeera's relationship with Anduin developed over time into something approaching siblinghood, or perhaps the bond between an aunt and a favored nephew. She watched over him, protected him when necessary, and served as a messenger for secrets that he did not want even his father to know. In many ways, she became part of the Wrynn family in all but blood. Her magic addiction remained a concern, though it was more manageable now that she was no longer under demonic influence. The Blood Elves had developed various methods for dealing with their racial affliction, from draining magical energy from external sources to more controversial techniques involving fel magic. Valeera found her own balance, managing her condition without letting it control her life. The methods available to Blood Elves for managing their addiction had evolved significantly since the fall of the Sunwell. In the early years, many had turned to fel magic, draining demons of their energy to sustain themselves. This approach was controversial, as the fel energies carried their own risks of corruption, but it was effective. Other Blood Elves had learned to siphon arcane energy from magical creatures, from ambient sources, from any repository of power they could find. For Valeera, operating primarily in human territories, access to these traditional Blood Elf methods was limited. She could not simply walk into a fel crystal repository in Silvermoon whenever she needed a fix. Instead, she had to be creative, finding sources of magical energy wherever she could, managing her needs with whatever resources were available. The restored Sunwell eventually offered a solution that did not require the problematic methods of the past. With the font of power rekindled, Blood Elves could once again draw upon its holy energies, sustaining themselves without the risks associated with fel magic. But the Sunwell was far from Stormwind, and Valeera's duties kept her away from her homeland more often than not. She developed techniques that allowed her to manage her addiction even without regular access to concentrated magical sources. Meditation, discipline, the careful rationing of the magical energy she did absorb, all of these became part of her daily routine. The addiction never went away, never stopped whispering its demands in the back of her mind, but she learned to live with it, to function despite it, to refuse to let it define her. The experience of managing addiction gave Valeera a perspective that many of her Blood Elf kin lacked. She understood what it meant to be constantly hungry for something that was not always available, to have to make do with less than ideal solutions, to struggle against cravings that could not be fully satisfied. This understanding shaped her compassion for others who faced similar struggles, whether with magical addiction or with other dependencies. Years passed in Stormwind. Valeera watched Anduin grow from a boy into a young man, watched Varian struggle with his own demons and his complicated feelings about the Horde, watched the world change around them as new threats emerged and old ones faded. She was present for important moments and absent for others, her work as a spy taking her to places far from the capital. The cataclysm came, reshaping the world as Deathwing emerged from his prison in Deepholm. The Mad Aspect's rampage destroyed coastlines, tore open new passages between lands, and killed countless innocents across both continents. Valeera was in Stormwind during the initial attack, present when Deathwing himself flew over the city and laid waste to portions of the Park District. The devastation reminded her, perhaps uncomfortably, of the destruction of Quel'Thalas. She aided in the recovery efforts, using her skills to gather intelligence on the new threats that had emerged in the aftermath of the cataclysm. The world had changed, and understanding those changes was essential for anyone who hoped to navigate them. Valeera's network of contacts expanded during this period as she made connections with individuals across both factions who shared information for their own reasons. The war against Deathwing eventually ended with the Aspect's death at the Maelstrom, but the world he had reshaped remained transformed. New tensions between Horde and Alliance began to simmer, foreshadowing the conflicts that would eventually erupt into open warfare. Valeera observed these developments with growing concern, aware that her unique position might become untenable if the factions truly went to war. The events in Pandaria tested those concerns. The discovery of the hidden continent brought new wonders and new horrors, including the Shah, manifestations of negative emotions that fed on the conflict between the factions. The war that Garrosh Hellscream, then war chief of the Horde, waged against the Alliance brought both factions to the shores of Pandaria, where their battles awakened ancient evils that had been dormant for millennia. Valeera's role during this period is not fully documented, but her continued presence in Stormwind suggests that she remained focused on her primary duties. She would have reported on events in Pandaria through her network, would have provided Varian with intelligence that he could not obtain through official channels, would have continued to serve as the shadow that protected the king and his interests. She became, in many ways, the royal family's secret weapon. When Varian needed information that SI-7, the Alliance intelligence organization, could not obtain, Valeera could often acquire it. When Anduin needed to communicate with someone outside normal diplomatic channels, Valeera could carry the message. Her unique position, trusted by the Wrynns but not bound by Alliance protocols, made her invaluable for tasks that fell outside conventional approaches. The connection to her Blood Elf heritage remained strong throughout this period. Valeera proudly identified as Sindore, defending her people's choices even when those choices were controversial. When others criticized the Blood Elves for their alliance with Illidan, for their methods of dealing with magical addiction, for their membership in the Horde, Valeera pushed back. Her people had done what they needed to do to survive, and she would not apologize for that. This fierce defense of Blood Elf identity occasionally created awkward moments in Stormwind. Some humans, particularly those who had lost family members in conflicts involving the Horde, found it difficult to accept a Blood Elf in such a position of trust. They whispered about Valeera in the corridors of the keep, wondered what information she might be sending to Silvermoon, questioned whether her loyalty could truly be trusted. Valeera was aware of these whispers, but largely unconcerned by them. She knew that her loyalty to Varian was genuine, that she would never betray his trust for the sake of political alignment. The opinions of people who did not know her who judged her based on the shape of her ears or the color of her eyes, were not worth her consideration. She had proven herself through years of faithful service, and those who chose not to see that were not worth the effort of convincing. The relationship with Anduin during these years was particularly important. The young prince, who would eventually become king himself, was someone Valeera could mentor in ways that his father could not. Varian was a warrior, direct and powerful, who solved problems through strength and determination. Valeera offered a different perspective, showing Anduin how subtlety and information could accomplish what brute force could not. Anduin's natural inclination toward diplomacy and healing made him receptive to Valeera's teachings. He understood that not all problems could be solved with a sword, that sometimes the most important victories came through understanding your enemies rather than destroying them. Valeera reinforced these instincts, giving him concrete examples from her own experience of how careful maneuvering could achieve better outcomes than direct confrontation. The bond between them was one of mutual respect and genuine affection. Valeera saw in Anduin a young man who was trying to be good in a world that often punished goodness, who held onto his principles despite pressure to abandon them. Anduin saw in Valeera a woman who had survived terrible things without losing her capacity for connection, who had found a way to be true to herself despite the expectations of others. This balance, this ability to serve a human king while maintaining her blood elf identity, was perhaps Valeera's greatest achievement during these years. She proved that loyalty could transcend faction, that friendship could cross racial boundaries, that a person's worth was not determined by the flag they flew. In a world defined by the conflict between Horde and Alliance, she carved out a space that belonged to neither and both. The death of Varian Wrynn at the Broken Shore was one of the most devastating moments in Alliance history. The Legion had returned, launching an invasion of Azeroth that dwarfed any previous attack. The combined forces of the Horde and Alliance had gathered to strike at the demon's beachhead, hoping to close the portal before the full weight of the burning Legion could pour through. The battle was a disaster. The Legion's forces were overwhelming, their defenses far stronger than anticipated. The Horde was forced to retreat when their leadership was threatened, and the Alliance, believing themselves abandoned, suffered catastrophic losses. Varian Wrynn, the king who had survived so much, who had gone from amnesiac gladiator to ruler of a great kingdom, gave his life to allow his soldiers to escape. For Valeera, the loss was deeply personal. Varian had been more than her employer, more than the king she served. He had been her friend, one of the first true friends she had known since her family's death. They had fought together in the arenas, had escaped slavery together, had faced Onyxia and Cho'Gall and countless other threats. He had trusted her when she was possessed by a demon, had given her a place in his kingdom when she had nowhere else to go. The news of Varian's death must have reached Valeera as it reached everyone else, through word of mouth and official announcements, and the visible grief of those who had known him. She had not been present at the Broken Shore, had not witnessed his final sacrifice. She learned of it secondhand, receiving the information that the man she cared about was gone, that the one who had anchored her life for years had been taken from her. The experience of loss was not new to Valeera. She had lost her family as a child, had lost blood eye in the arena, had watched countless people die in the years of her eventful life. But each loss was unique. Each one carried its own weight of grief. The loss of Varian was particularly heavy because it was the loss of someone who had chosen to be important to her, who had seen her worth and offered her a place when she had nothing. The funeral of a king is a public event, a spectacle designed as much for the living as for the dead. Varian's funeral would have been attended by nobles and commoners, by leaders and soldiers, by all those who wished to pay their respects to the fallen monarch. Valeera's presence at such an event would have been complicated by her position, a blood elf among the mourners of an alliance king, but she would have been there nonetheless. She had promised loyalty to Varian and to his son, and that loyalty did not end with death. She would have stood in the shadows, perhaps, or in a position away from the main gathering, but she would have been present. She owed him that much, at the very least. The grief she felt was complicated by her unique position. She was not an alliance citizen mourning her sovereign. She was a blood elf mourning her friend, a spy who had lost her most important client, a shadow suddenly cast into the light by the death of the one who had given her purpose. The structure that had defined her life for years had collapsed with Varian's death, but Valeera had promised loyalty to both Varian and his son. With Varian gone, that loyalty transferred fully to Anduin, the young man who now bore the weight of Stormwind's crown. Anduin needed her now more than ever, a young king facing a world at war, surrounded by enemies and uncertain allies. She would serve him as she had served his father. The war against the Legion continued, and Valeera found a new role within it. The Uncrowned, a secretive organization of rogues that operated from the shadows of Dalaran, emerged as one of the major forces in the conflict. This council of shadows brought together rogues from both Horde and Alliance, united by their profession rather than their faction, working together against a common enemy that threatened everyone. The philosophy of the Uncrowned was one that resonated with Valeera's own approach to factional conflict. They recognized that the threats facing Azeroth were too great for petty divisions, that rogues of all factions had more in common with each other than with the politicians and generals who commanded their nominal loyalty. The Uncrowned operated according to their own code, answering to their own council, pursuing the protection of Azeroth by whatever means they deemed necessary. The Hall of Shadows, the Uncrowned's hidden base beneath Dalaran, was a remarkable achievement of secrecy and construction. Located in the sewers of the floating city, it was a place that most people did not know existed, a headquarters for an organization that operated entirely in the shadows. The entrance was hidden, the defenses formidable, and the membership carefully vetted. Only those who had proven their worth as rogues, who had demonstrated their commitment to the organization's goals, were permitted to enter. For Valeera, the Hall of Shadows represented a kind of homecoming. She had always been most comfortable in the shadows, had built her life around operating unseen and unknown. The Uncrowned were her kind of people, professionals who understood the value of discretion, who knew that sometimes the most important work was done by those whose names were never recorded and whose faces were never seen. The organization's structure was relatively flat, with a council of senior members making decisions that affected the whole group. Unlike the hierarchical structures of military organizations or noble courts, the uncrowned valued competence over rank, results over titles. A rogue who could get the job done was valued regardless of their background or their factional allegiance. Valeera became part of the uncrowned, working from their hidden base in the Hall of Shadows beneath Dalaran. It was a role that suited her perfectly, combining her skills as a rogue with her unique position between the factions. The uncrowned did not care that she was a blood elf serving an alliance king. They cared only that she was skilled, trustworthy, and willing to fight against the demons. Within the Hall of Shadows, Valeera worked alongside some of the most dangerous rogues on Azeroth. Garona Halforsen, the half-orc assassin who had been forced to kill King Lane of Stormwind decades earlier. Fleet Admiral Tethys, who commanded the Bloodsail Buccaneers. Marin Noggenfogger, the Goblin Crime Lord of Gadgetsan. Master Matthias Shaw, the leader of SI-27 himself. These were the Council of Shadows, and Valeera was now one of them. Her skills proved valuable in the fight against the Legion. She helped rogues retrieve the artifact weapons they would need to combat the demons, including the fangs of the Devourer, deadly daggers that had been wielded by previous assassins. She deciphered encrypted communications, uncovered intelligence about Legion plans, and performed the kinds of covert operations that only someone with her abilities could accomplish. One of her most important contributions was the discovery that Matthias Shaw had been replaced by a dreadlord. Deatharok, one of the Nethrazim who served the Legion, had captured Shaw and taken his place, using the position to feed false intelligence to the Alliance and undermine their war effort. Valeera helped expose this deception, freeing the real Shaw and eliminating the demon imposter. The implications of this discovery were profound. Deatharok had been in a position to influence Alliance military strategy, to misdirect resources, to betray operational security. The intelligence that had been passing through SI-7 during his impersonation was compromised, potentially explaining setbacks and losses that might otherwise have seemed inexplicable. The damage he had done would take time to assess and repair. For Valeera, the confrontation with Deatharok carried personal resonance. She had once been possessed by a dreadlord, had experienced firsthand the manipulative cruelty of Cathra Natir. Facing another of that demon's kind, seeing the havoc that Deatharok had wrought from within the Alliance's own intelligence apparatus, reminded her of the threat that the Nethrazim represented. These were not mindless destroyers, but cunning infiltrators who worked patiently to corrupt and undermine. The liberation of the real Matthias Shaw was a moment of triumph for the uncrowned and for Valeera personally. Shaw had been held captive, while his identity was used to betray everything he had worked to protect. His rescue and the exposure of Deatharok's deception were victories that would have lasting consequences for the war effort. Valeera's reputation within the rogue community was enhanced by her role in this affair. She had demonstrated not only combat skills, but also the investigative abilities and instincts that separated great rogues from merely good ones. The Council of Shadows took note, recognizing her as an asset whose value went beyond her personal connections to the Wrynn family. The war eventually ended with the defeat of the Legion and the imprisonment of Sargeras. The burning crusade that had threatened the cosmos for millennia was finally over, its forces scattered and its leaders destroyed or contained. Azeroth had survived, though the cost had been enormous. The end of the Legion War brought a strange sense of displacement for those who had fought in it. For months, years, the focus had been on the demons, on the existential threat that had united factions and individuals who would otherwise have been enemies. With that threat removed, the A's old divisions reasserted themselves. The ancient enmities that had been suppressed in the face of common danger suddenly seemed relevant again. For Valeera, the transition from wartime to peacetime was complicated by her position between the factions. During the Legion invasion, her status as a blood elf working for an alliance king had been less problematic because everyone was fighting the same enemy. Now, with the factions eyeing each other suspiciously across the rubble of their shared victory, her ambiguous allegiances became awkward again. The wound that Sargera had left in Silithus became a source of new conflict almost immediately. Azerite, the blood of the world's soul, began to seep from the wound, and both Horde and Alliance recognized its potential as a power source. The scramble to control this new resource began to generate tensions that would eventually explode into open warfare. Valeera watched these developments with concern but without surprise. She had seen enough of factional conflict to know that peace was always temporary, that the hatreds which drove the Horde and Alliance to war with each other ran too deep to be permanently resolved. The Legion had provided a common enemy that forced cooperation. With that enemy defeated, the old patterns would reassert themselves. The personal cost of the Legion War was something that Valeera processed privately. She had lost colleagues in the conflict, had seen people she respected killed by demons, had witnessed suffering on a scale that even her experience had not prepared her for. The victory celebrations felt hollow to her, premature optimism about a future that she suspected would bring new conflicts and new losses. Valeera emerged from the conflict with her reputation enhanced and her network of contacts expanded. She was no longer just the Wrynn's private spy. She was a recognized figure in the shadow community, someone whose skills and integrity were respected by rogues of all factions. The position she had carved out for herself had grown more secure, even as the world around her continued to change. The Fourth War erupted not long after the Legion's defeat, pitting Horde and Alliance against each other in a conflict that threatened to destroy both factions. Sylvanas Windrunner, now War Chief of the Horde, launched a surprise attack on the Alliance-held territories of Darkshore and Teldrassil. The burning of the World Tree, the genocide of the Night Elven people who lived there, was an atrocity that shocked even many within the Horde. Anduin, now High King of the Alliance, led his faction's response. The war that followed was brutal, encompassing battles across multiple continents and costing countless lives on both sides. Old hatreds were inflamed, new wounds were opened, and the possibility of peace seemed more distant than ever. Valeera's position during this conflict was more complicated than ever. She served Anduin, but she remained a blood elf, technically a subject of a Horde nation. She had friends on both sides of the conflict, people she cared about who were now killing each other. The neutrality she had maintained for years was increasingly difficult to sustain when the factions were actively at war. Anduin used her unique position for his own purposes. He needed to communicate with those in the Horde who opposed Sylvanas, who believed that the war chief was leading their faction to disaster. But he could not do so through official channels, could not trust normal diplomatic methods when spies and traitors might be watching. He needed someone who could move between worlds, who could carry messages that official couriers could not. The clandestine nature of this work required Valeera to operate with even more secrecy than usual. She could not simply walk into Horde territory and request an audience with Bane Bloodhoof. She had to move carefully, avoiding both Sylvanas' loyalists and the regular alliance, forces who might not understand her mission. Every step was calculated, every contact carefully vetted, every communication protected by multiple layers of security. The trust that Anduin placed in Valeera for these missions spoke to the depth of their relationship. He was essentially using her as his personal back channel to potential allies within the enemy faction, bypassing not only the official diplomatic corps, but also SI-7 and other intelligence organizations. If discovered, such activities could be seen as treasonous, as conspiring with the enemy. Anduin was betting his reputation and potentially his throne on Valeera's discretion and skill. She did not let him down. The messages she carried, the connections she facilitated, helped lay the groundwork for the eventual resistance to Sylvanas within the Horde. When the war chief's true nature was finally revealed, when her betrayal of the Horde became impossible to deny, those who had been secretly working against her were ready to act. Valeera's shadow diplomacy had helped create the conditions for Sylvanas' eventual fall. The personal risk that Valeera took in this work was considerable. If she had been captured by Sylvanas' forces, the consequences would have been severe. She was not merely a spy, but a traitor in the eyes of those loyal to the war chief, a blood elf who had thrown in her lot with the Alliance and was now actively working to undermine Horde leadership. Execution would have been the best she could hope for. Torture and public humiliation were more likely. Valeera became Anduin's personal spy in the fullest sense of the term. She carried secret letters to Bane Bloodhoof, the Tauren chieftain who was one of the most prominent voices of dissent within the Horde. She reported on Azeroth, the old god whose awakening threatened both factions. She served as a bridge between those who wanted peace and those who were fighting a war. The letter she carried to Bane concerned a sensitive matter: Anduin's desire to arrange meetings between Forsaken and their living relatives. It was an attempt to build connections across factional lines, to remind people that the enemy was not a faceless horde, but individuals with families and histories. It was the kind of idealistic gesture that was typical of Anduin, and Valeera cautioned him that many would not support such efforts. Her warning proved prescient. Perith Stormhoof, the Tauren warrior she approached with the letter, refused to accept it. He feared for his chieftain's safety, worried that any connection to the Alliance would be seen as treason by Sylvanas' loyalists. The attempt at reconciliation failed before it could begin, another casualty of the war's escalating tensions. But Valeera's efforts were not entirely in vain. The channels she established, the trust she built with those on the Horde side who opposed Sylvanas, would prove valuable as the war continued. When Bane was arrested for helping Derek Proudmoore escape from Sylvanas' control, the network that Valeera had helped create facilitated his rescue. When the war finally turned against Sylvanas, those who had worked secretly for peace were ready to step forward. The war ended with Sylvanas' betrayal of the Horde and her subsequent flight. A new Horde council was formed to replace the position of war chief, sharing power among the faction's leaders rather than concentrating it in a single individual. The armistice that followed was fragile, the wounds of war still raw, but it was a beginning. The revelation of Sylvanas' true motives, her secret pact with the jailer of the Maw, cast the entire Fourth War in a different light. The war chief had been working toward goals that transcended the conflict between Horde and Alliance, using the war as a means to empower forces in the Shadowlands. The burning of Teldrassil, the campaign against the Alliance, all of it had been in service of a plan that most of those who fought for her had not understood. For the Horde, this revelation was devastating. Many had followed Sylvanas out of loyalty, out of belief in her leadership, out of commitment to the faction she represented. To learn that they had been manipulated, that their sacrifices had served purposes alien to everything the Horde claimed to stand for, created a crisis of identity that would take years to resolve. For Valeera, the outcome was bittersweet. She had never trusted Sylvanas, had always sensed something off about the Banshee Queen's motivations. But she also understood that the soldiers who had fought for Sylvanas were not all villains. Many of them had been doing what they believed was right, following orders from a leader they trusted. The distinction between those who had known of Sylvanas' true plans and those who had been deceived was not always easy to draw. The formation of the Horde Council represented a significant change in how the faction would be governed. Instead of a single war chief wielding absolute authority, power would be shared among representatives of the various races that made up the Horde. This structure, while potentially slower and more fractious than individual leadership, was designed to prevent the kind of centralized corruption that had allowed Sylvanas to lead the Horde astray. Valeera was present at High Overlord Saurfang's funeral, one of the few blood elves openly associated with the Alliance who attended. She left through a portal to Borealis with the Alliance delegation, making no secret of her loyalties, even in a gathering that included leaders from both factions. Her position had always been unusual, and the funeral of a Horde hero was not the place to pretend otherwise. The years that followed the Fourth War saw Valeera continue her role as a shadow operative, working primarily for Anduin, but maintaining her independence and her connections across factional lines. She had become something of an institution, a known quantity whose unusual position was accepted precisely because she had proven her reliability over so many years. When the Scourge began to rampage across Azeroth following the destruction of the Helm of Domination and the Lich King's departure from his frozen throne, Valeera was among those who mobilized to contain the threat. The undead were attacking everywhere, their former master's control removed, their hunger for the living unchecked. Both Horde and Alliance scrambled to defend their territories. Valeera asked Horde heroes to report to Lor'themar Theron in Orgrimmar, helping coordinate the response to the crisis. When it became clear that leaders from both factions had been abducted, including Jaina Proudmoore and Anduin himself, she shared this information across factional lines. The emergency was too great for normal divisions to apply. She also formed an unlikely friendship with Kalia Menethil during this period. Kalia was the sister of Arthas. Menethil, the former prince of Lordaeron who had become the Lich King. She had been killed and resurrected as an undead through the power of the light, becoming something unprecedented. A light-forged undead who served neither the Scourge nor the Forsaken, but something entirely new. The two women found common ground, despite their very different backgrounds. Both existed outside normal categories. Both had experienced losses that defined their lives. Both served causes larger than themselves while maintaining their individual identities. Their friendship represented the kind of connection that could be built even in the midst of cosmic conflict. Callia's story had its own tragic dimensions. She had been the princess of Lordaeron, heir to a kingdom that no longer existed, sister to the man who had become the Lich King. She had spent years in hiding, watching from afar as her homeland was destroyed and then occupied by the undead. When she had finally emerged, it was only to be killed by Sylvanas Windrunner during a disastrous meeting between Forsaken and their living relatives. Her resurrection through the power of the light had created something unprecedented. Callia was undead, but not like the Forsaken. She was suffused with holy energy, a being who existed in a state that no one fully understood. The light that had brought her back had also changed her in ways that were still being discovered. She was, in her own way, as much an outsider as Valeera. The conversations between Valeera and Callia during this period touched on themes that were central to both their lives: identity, belonging, loss, purpose, the difficulty of fitting into a world that did not have a category for what you were. Callia understood what it meant to be caught between worlds, to be neither fully one thing nor fully another. Valeera had lived that experience for years. Their friendship was also practical. Both women had valuable perspectives on the current crisis, had insights that could help those working to rescue the abducted leaders. Callia knew the Shadowlands in ways that living people could not, had connections to the realm of death that might prove useful. Valeera knew the politics of the living world, had contacts and networks that could be mobilized if needed. The events in Shadowlands proceeded without direct involvement from either woman. The rescue of the abducted leaders, the confrontation with the jailer, the eventual resolution of the crisis, all of these happened in a realm that Valeera could not enter. But she waited, maintaining her networks, ready to help when the opportunity arose. The work of a shadow operative was often about patience, about being ready when the moment came. The events in Shadowlands, the realm of the dead where the abducted leaders had been taken, proceeded without Valeera's direct involvement. Her domain was the living world, the shadows of Azeroth rather than the realms beyond death. But she waited, and she watched, and she was ready when those she cared about returned. When the Dragon Isles were rediscovered and the aspects began to restore their power, Valeera's involvement was more peripheral. The great events that unfolded there, the awakening of the incarnates and the restoration of Azeroth's dragonflights, were not her theater of operations. But she remained connected to events through her networks, aware of what was happening even when she was not directly participating. Time-displaced versions of Valeera's, Varian, and Brawl appeared in the Field of Ferocity on the Dragon Isles, echoes of their gladiatorial past transported across time and space. These temporal anomalies challenged combatants who sought to test themselves, refusing to return through their portals until they had been defeated in combat. It was a strange reminder of how far Valeera had come from those days in the arena, and how much of that past still defined her. When Dalaran was destroyed by the forces of Xal'atath, the harbinger of the void, Valeera was among the survivors. The city that had housed the Hall of Shadows, that had served as the base for the Uncrowned during the Legion War, was gone. But the organization itself persisted, and Valeera helped relocate some of her fellow rogues to Dornegal, the new hub of operations in the recently discovered lands of Kaz Algar. In Dornegal, she found ways to pass the time between missions. Most notably, she proved herself a master of Hearthstone, the card game that had become popular across Azeroth. She played against Millhouse Manastorm, the notoriously unlucky gnome mage, and won so decisively that she took everything he owned, including his clothes. It was a moment of levity in a life that had seen so much darkness, a reminder that Valeera was still capable of enjoying simple pleasures, despite everything she had experienced. The game of Hearthstone had spread across Azeroth in the years since its creation, becoming a popular pastime for people of all factions and races. The game's origins lay in a tavern where patrons had developed a card-based representation of the great heroes and conflicts of Azerothian history. What had started as a simple diversion had grown into a phenomenon with tournaments, professional players, and a dedicated following. For Valeera, who served as the default rogue hero in the game's representation, the popularity of Hearthstone carried a certain irony. Her image was used by players across the world, her voice lines repeated by those who had never met her, her moves mimicked in virtual form by people who knew nothing of her true history. She had become a symbol, a brand, a representation of the rogue class that was divorced from the complex reality of who she actually was. Her victory over Millhouse Manastorm was a minor moment in her larger story, but it captured something essential about her character. Even after everything she had been through, the losses and the trauma and the cosmic conflicts, she could still enjoy a simple game, could still take pleasure in outmaneuvering an opponent, could still laugh at the absurdity of taking a mage's clothes as a gambling prize. She had not lost her capacity for joy, despite all the darkness she had experienced. The destruction of Dalaran had forced many organizations to relocate, and the Uncrowned were among them. The Hall of Shadows, their hidden headquarters beneath the floating city, was gone along with the city itself. The rogues who had called it home were scattered, their organization temporarily disrupted by the loss of their central meeting place. But organizations like the Uncrowned were resilient. They had survived worse than the destruction of a single headquarters, had operated in the shadows long before Dalaran became their base. The move to Dornegal was a temporary measure, a regrouping while they figured out their next steps. Valeera, as one of their senior members, was involved in these discussions, helping to shape the organization's future, even as she continued her personal work for Anduin. The announcement that Valeera would serve as a delving companion in the upcoming Midnight expansion marked a new chapter in her ongoing story. Delving, the exploration of dangerous underground areas filled with treasures and monsters, had become a popular activity among adventurers. Having a skilled companion for these expeditions was essential, and Valeera's abilities made her an ideal choice. The flexibility she would offer to delvers was remarkable. Unlike most companions, who specialized in a single role, Valeera could adapt to whatever was needed. She could serve as damage, striking from the shadows to eliminate enemies with her rogue skills. She could serve as healer, her vampiric reaping ability draining life force from enemies and distributing it to allies. She could even serve as tank, using her agility and combat experience to hold enemy attention while others struck from behind. The vampiric reaping ability represented an evolution of her combat techniques, a way of channeling the life force she absorbed into healing energy. It was reminiscent of the way she had once absorbed magical energy from the Naga Sea Witch's trident, but now directed toward helping others rather than feeding her addiction. She had learned to transform what had once been a liability into an asset. The path to midnight would take her back to Quel'Thalas, the homeland she had fled as a child. The Blood Elven kingdom had been partially restored since the Scourge invasion, the Sunwell rekindled, and its energies once again sustaining her people. But Silvermoon and its surroundings bore the scars of that ancient assault, and returning there would surely awaken memories that Valeera had spent years trying to process. The prospect of returning to Quel'Thalas carried emotional weight that few other destinations could match. Valeera had left her homeland as a traumatized child, fleeing from the death of her family and the destruction of everything she had known. She had built her life elsewhere, had found new families and new purposes in places far from Silvermoon. The blood elf who would return to Quel'Thalas was not the child who had fled from it, but the echoes of that child's pain would certainly accompany her. The changes that had occurred in Quel'Thalas since Valeera's departure were significant. The Ghostlands, the southern portion of the kingdom that had been most devastated by the Scourge, remained corrupted and dangerous. But Eversong Woods had been largely restored, its eternal autumn beauty recreated through blood, elven magic, and determination. Silvermoon itself had been rebuilt, its western half still in ruins, but its eastern half restored to something approaching its former glory. The Sunwell, the heart of blood elven civilization, had been rekindled through the sacrifice of the Naaru Mauru and the intervention of Prophet Velen. Its holy energies now sustained the Blood Elves, as they had before the Scourge invasion, though the nature of those energies had changed. Where once the Sunwell had been purely arcane, it now blended arcane and holy power, a fusion that represented the Blood Elves' evolution as a people. Returning to this transformed homeland would mean confronting Valeera's own complicated feelings about her identity. She had lived as an outsider for so long, had defined herself in opposition to factional expectations, had built her life in the shadows between Horde and Alliance. Coming back to the place where she had been born, to the people she shared blood with but not experience, would challenge the identity she had constructed. The threats facing Quel'Thalas in the Midnight Era were connected to the larger cosmic conflicts that had been building throughout the World Soul Saga. The void forces that had been gathering strength, the remnants of Xal'atath's influence, the ongoing struggles between light and shadow, all of these would converge on the Blood Elven homeland in ways that were not yet fully understood. Valeera's skills as a shadow operative would be tested by enemies who could themselves command the shadows. The role of the Blood Elves in this conflict was particularly significant. The Sunwell, with its unique blend of arcane and holy energies, represented something that void forces could not easily corrupt. The Blood Elves' experience with magical addiction had given them resilience against certain forms of corruption, though it had also left them vulnerable to others. The battle for Quel'Thalas would be a battle for the soul of a people who had already survived so much. The psychological dimension of returning to Quel'Thalas deserves particular consideration. Valeera had left her homeland as a traumatized child, her memories of the place forever colored by loss and horror. The Eversong woods that she might have explored as an innocent youth, the streets of Silvermoon where she might have learned her family's traditions, the ancestral connections that should have defined her place in Blood Elf society, all of these had been stolen from her by the Scourge's invasion. When she returns now, it will be as something utterly different from the child who fled. She has become a master of shadows, a trusted agent of kings, a survivor of demonic possession, a veteran of cosmic conflicts. The scared girl who ran from burning Silvermoon has been transformed into a weapon of legendary capability. Yet somewhere within her, that child still exists, still carries the wounds that never fully healed. The geography of her homeland will confront her with memories at every turn. The dead scar that still besecks Quel'Thalas, the path that Arthas carved through the kingdom on his march to the Sunwell, serves as a permanent reminder of what was lost. The ghostlands to the south remain corrupted, a visible scar that will never fully heal. Even the restored portions of the kingdom carry echoes of what was destroyed, rebuilt architecture that cannot recreate the history that once filled those spaces. The people of Quel'Thalas who remained, who rebuilt, who raised new generations in the shadow of the Scourge's devastation, have their own relationship with the homeland that Valeera lacks. They have lived through the long years of reconstruction, have participated in the collective healing that comes from shared work toward a common goal. Valeera was absent for all of this, building her life elsewhere while her people struggled to rebuild theirs. This creates a complicated dynamic for her return. She is Sindore, shares blood and heritage with those who remained, yet her experiences have been fundamentally different from theirs. She has seen more of the world than most blood elves, has formed bonds with people of many races, has developed perspectives that the more insular residents of Silvermoon might not understand or appreciate. The question of belonging becomes central when one returns to a home that has continued without them. Is Valeera truly coming home when she returns to Quel'Thalas, or is she simply visiting a place that shares her ancestry? The answer likely lies somewhere between these poles, in the complex territory where identity and geography intersect. What she would find there, what role she would play in the events of Midnight, remained to be seen. But Valeera had proven herself adaptable, capable of facing new challenges and emerging stronger from them. Whatever waited in Quel'Thalas, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through slavery, demonic possession, and all the other trials of her life. The evolution of Valeera as a character reflected the evolution of World of Warcraft itself. She had first appeared in the comic book series that launched in 2007, a supporting character in what was essentially Varian, Wrynn's story. Over the years, she had grown into a figure of significance in her own right, appearing in multiple expansions, developing relationships with various major characters, and building a reputation that extended beyond her original role. The World of Warcraft comic series that introduced Valeera was written by Walter Simonson, a legendary comic book creator known for his work on Thor and other major titles. The art was provided by various artists over the series' run, including Ludo Lullaby and Sandra Hope. The quality of the creative team reflected Blizzard's commitment to telling stories that would stand alongside the game itself, narratives that expanded the lore in ways that in-game storytelling could not always accomplish. In the comics, Valeera was developed from the very first issue as a central character alongside Varian and Brawl. Her backstory was established gradually, revealing details about her past as the story progressed. The demonic possession arc, which would become one of the defining elements of her character, unfolded over multiple issues, giving readers time to understand the stakes and the psychological toll the possession was taking on her. The comic series ran for 25 issues, covering the period from Varian's time as a gladiator through his return to Stormwind and the defeat of Onyxia. Valeera appeared in most of these issues, her role growing as the series progressed. By the end, she had been established as one of the most important figures in Varian's life, a trusted friend whose loyalty transcended the boundaries of faction. After the main comic series ended, Valeera continued to appear in other Warcraft comics and graphic novels. Her story was expanded through appearances in the Shaman graphic novel and other publications that explored corners of the Warcraft universe that the main game could not fully address. These appearances kept her relevant, even during periods when she was not appearing prominently in the game itself. The transition from comic book character to in-game presence was gradual. Valeera first appeared in World of Warcraft during the Scourge invasion event that preceded the launch of Wrath of the Lich King. She stood beside Varian during the defense of Stormwind against the undead, a visual representation of the bond that the comics had established between them. This appearance validated the comic series as part of the official canon, confirming that the events depicted in its pages were as real as anything that happened in the game. Her presence in 3 different Blizzard games, World of Warcraft, Hearthstone, and Heroes of the Storm, spoke to her enduring appeal. In Hearthstone, she served as the default hero for the rogue class, introducing players to the game through her persona. In Heroes of the Storm, she was a playable assassin character, bringing her stealth and combo-based combat style to the MOBA format. Across these different contexts, her core identity remained consistent, a blood elf rogue who walked between worlds, loyal to her friends rather than to factions. The mechanics of Valeera in Heroes of the Storm were particularly well designed to capture her character. Her ability to stealth made her a dangerous ambush predator, capable of appearing seemingly from nowhere to devastate enemy heroes. Her combo point system rewarded the precise execution that real rogues needed to master, making her a high-skill ceiling hero that offered tremendous power to those who understood her nuances. Her talent choices in that game reflected the different aspects of her character. Some talents enhanced her assassination capabilities, making her even more lethal against isolated targets. Others improved her survival, allowing her to escape from situations that should have killed her. Still others enhanced her utility, giving her tools to control the battlefield in ways that went beyond simple damage. Each talent build represented a different way of interpreting who Valeera was and what she was best at. The voice lines that Tara Platt provided for Valeera in Heroes of the Storm captured the character's personality perfectly. The confidence, the danger, the hint of vulnerability beneath the competence, all of these were present in the performance. When Valeera spoke, players could hear the history behind her words, the experiences that had shaped her into who she was. The decision to make Valeera the default rogue hero in Hearthstone was significant for her visibility. Millions of players who had never engaged with the comics or the World of Warcraft story elements were introduced to her through this card game. She became the face of the rogue class for an entire generation of players, her image synonymous with stealth and combo attacks, and the quick, deadly strikes that defined the class's mechanical identity. The emotes and interactions available to Valeera in Hearthstone gave players a sense of her personality. Her greetings were confident, her thanks understated, her threats genuinely menacing. The animations that accompanied her plays showed a character who was skilled and knew it, who had earned her confidence through years of practice and performance. Even in the simplified context of a card game, Valeera remained recognizably herself. The story of Valeera Sanguinar is, in many ways, a story about identity and belonging. She was born a high elf, but became a blood elf through circumstances beyond her control. She lost her family to violence and found new families in the gladiator arena and in the royal court of Stormwind. She served an alliance king while proudly maintaining her Horde racial identity. She was possessed by a demon and freed through the sacrifice of a friend. Throughout all of these experiences, Valeera never lost her sense of self. She remained proud of her blood elf heritage, defending her people's choices even when she disagreed with specific decisions. She remained loyal to those who had earned her trust, maintaining relationships across factional lines when politics demanded that she choose sides. She remained a survivor, adapting to whatever circumstances she faced without surrendering her core values. The relationship between Valeera and the Wrynn family illustrated this aspect of her character perfectly. She had served Varian not because he was the king of Stormwind or the high king of the Alliance, but because he was her friend, the amnesiac gladiator who had fought beside her in the arena. When Varian died, she transferred that loyalty to Anduin not because he was the new king, but because she cared about him as a person. Her service was always personal, never political. This approach to loyalty put her at odds with the expectations of both factions. The Horde might have expected her to prioritize her blood elf identity, to support Silvermoon and its interests against the Alliance when conflicts arose. The Alliance might have expected her to fully embrace their cause, to become a human loyalist in blood elf clothing. She refused both demands, insisting on a loyalty that was hers to give, not theirs to claim. The friendship with Brawl Baremantle, maintained across the years despite their racial differences, demonstrated the possibility of connections that transcended ancient hatreds. Night elves and blood elves had been enemies since before either race bore those names, their conflict rooted in disagreements about magic and society that stretched back 10,000 years. Yet Brawl and Valeera had become as close as siblings, their bond forged in the arena and strengthened through shared adventures. Her struggle with magic addiction reflected the broader struggle of the Blood Elven people, but also carried a personal dimension that made it uniquely hers. The absorption of the Sea Witch's arcane energy had awakened an addiction that might have remained dormant. The demonic possession had exacerbated that addiction to nearly fatal levels, yet she had survived, had found ways to manage her condition, had refused to let it define her entirely. The demon possession itself was perhaps the most transformative experience of her life. To have an external force take control of your body, to be used as a puppet while aware of what is happening, to be tortured with visions of your dead parents by a creature that wants to consume your soul, these were experiences that would break many people. Valeera was bent by them, certainly, but not broken. She emerged from the possession with scars, but also with knowledge of her own strength. The visual representation of Valeera evolved significantly over the years. For over a decade after her in-game debut in 2008, she was represented by models that did not match the artwork that depicted her in other media. It was not until patch 8.2.5 in 2019 that she received a model update that reflected her canonical appearance, a delay that frustrated fans who knew her from the comics and other sources. Her voice was provided by Tara Platt, an actress known for her work in video games and animation. The voice performance brought Valeera to life in ways that text and static images could not, giving her a personality that extended beyond her written dialogue. The cold edge in her voice when facing enemies, the warmth when speaking with friends, the fierce pride when defending her people, all of these were conveyed through the performance. The iconic aspects of her appearance, the red and black color scheme that reflected Blood Elf aesthetics, the dual daggers that were her signature weapons, the lithe build of someone who relied on speed and agility rather than brute strength, became recognizable across multiple games and media. When players saw Valeera in Hearthstone or Heroes of the Storm, they knew immediately who she was and what she represented. Her representation in Hearthstone as the default rogue hero gave her particular prominence. For many players, she was their introduction to the class, the face they associated with stealth and combo attacks, and the shadowy arts of assassination. The alternate versions of her that could be unlocked, such as Captain Valeera the Pirate or Valeera the Hollow from the Knights of the Frozen Throne expansion, showed different aspects of her character while maintaining her essential identity. In Heroes of the Storm, she was designed as a melee assassin who specialized in ambushing enemies and shutting them down. Her abilities reflected her rogue training, with stealth mechanics, combo points, and finisher moves that rewarded precise play. She was difficult to master, but devastating in the hands of skilled players, a design philosophy that matched her character as someone who had survived through skill rather than raw power. The cross-media representation of Valeera demonstrated how a single character could be adapted to different contexts while maintaining their essential nature. In World of Warcraft, she was an NPC quest giver and story participant. In Hearthstone, she was a player avatar and collectible cards. In Heroes of the Storm, she was a playable hero with her own abilities and talents. Each version was different, but each was recognizably Valeera. The action figures and merchandise featuring Valeera further extended her presence beyond the games themselves. DC Unlimited produced a Valeera action figure as part of their World of Warcraft Series 1 line, capturing her iconic appearance in physical form. These products introduced her to collectors who might not have played the games, expanding her audience beyond the core Warcraft community. The artistic interpretations of Valeera varied across different media, but certain elements remained consistent. Her red hair, often depicted in elaborate styles that reflected Blood Elf aesthetics, became one of her most recognizable features. Her armor, a combination of leather and metal that prioritized mobility over protection, reflected her role as a rogue who relied on speed rather than durability. Her weapons, typically dual daggers or short swords, marked her as someone who fought up close and personal. The community response to Valeera over the years reflected her unusual position in the Warcraft universe. Some fans appreciated her as a complex character who defied easy categorization, a blood elf who was neither fully Horde nor fully Alliance. Others criticized her for the same reasons, arguing that her divided loyalties made her difficult to relate to or invest in. The debates about her character reflected broader discussions within the community about faction identity and the possibility of neutrality in a world defined by conflict. The fan art and fan fiction featuring Valeera demonstrated her enduring appeal to the creative community. Artists reimagined her in countless styles, from faithful recreations of her official appearance to wildly divergent interpretations that explored different aspects of her character. Writers crafted stories that filled in gaps in her official narrative, imagining conversations and adventures that the games and comics had not depicted. This creative engagement suggested that Valeera had become a character that fans felt ownership of, someone they cared about enough to invest their own creative energy in. The Blood Elf identity that Valeera embraced carried significant weight within the context of Warcraft lore. The Sindore were a people defined by tragedy and resilience, by the determination to survive, even when survival required compromising the principles that had once guided them. Valeera's personal story, from orphaned child to gladiator slave to trusted spy, mirrored the broader arc of her people in many ways. The Blood Elves had made choices that many considered controversial. They had allied with Illidan's Storm Rage when he offered them a way to address their magical addiction. They had joined the Horde after humans under Grand Marshal Garithos had betrayed them during the aftermath of Lordaeron's fall. They had used fail magic and drained energy from captured demons to sustain themselves when other options seemed inadequate. These choices had been born of desperation rather than malice, but they had earned the Blood Elves' criticism from those who did not understand the depths of their need. Valeera defended these choices whenever they were questioned. She understood, as only someone who had experienced the magical addiction could understand, why her people had done what they did. The hunger that the destruction of the Sunwell had created was not a metaphor or an abstract concept. It was a physical reality, a need as urgent and as impossible to ignore as the need for food or water. Those who criticized the Blood Elves for the methods they used to address that hunger had never felt its grip on their own souls. At the same time, Valeera was not blind to the excesses that had occurred in her people's name. She had seen how the pursuit of magical sustenance could lead to darker paths, how the desperation to survive could corrupt the very survival it was meant to secure. Her own experience with the demon Cathra had shown her how vulnerable the addicted were to exploitation by those who offered power in exchange for control. The rekindling of the Sunwell, accomplished through the sacrifice of the Draenei prophet Velen and the purified essence of Anaru, had offered the Blood Elves a path back from the brink. With the Sunwell restored, the desperate measures that had defined the years of its absence were no longer necessary. The Blood Elves could return to the arcane traditions of their high elven ancestors, sustained by the pure energy of their restored font of power. For Valeera, this restoration was bittersweet. She had never known the Sunwell in its original form, had been too young when it fell to have the direct connection that older Blood Elves remembered. The restored Sunwell was significant to her people, but it was not the homecoming for her that it was for others. Her connection to Quel'Thalas remained complicated, a mixture of pride and pain that could not be easily resolved. The relationship between Valeera and Silvermoon, the capital of the Blood Elves, was never simple. She had fled her homeland as a child, had built her life elsewhere, had formed her primary bonds with people who were not Blood Elves. When she returned to Silvermoon, as she occasionally did in the course of her work, she was at once a native daughter and a stranger, someone who shared the blood of the Sindore, but not the lived experience of their community. Lor'themar Theron, the regent lord who led the Blood Elves in the absence of their prince, was aware of Valeera and her unusual position. His intelligence networks had tracked her activities, noted her connections to the Alliance, assessed her as both a potential asset and a potential threat. He had apparently concluded that she was worth tolerating, that her loyalty to Silvermoon's interests, while not absolute, was genuine enough to warrant acceptance. The Blood Elf community's attitude toward Valeera was mixed. Some saw her as a traitor, a Sindore who had thrown in her lot with the humans rather than remaining true to her people. Others saw her as an asset, a deep cover agent whose connections to the Alliance could be valuable in times of need. Still others simply did not know what to make of her, uncertain how to categorize someone who defied the normal boundaries of factional loyalty. Valeera herself seems to have been comfortable with this ambiguity. She did not seek acceptance from Silvermoon society, did not try to justify her choices to those who criticized them. She was who she was, a Blood Elf who served human kings, a Horde racial whose closest friends were Alliance, a creature of the shadows who walked in whatever light suited her purposes. Those who could not accept that were free to keep their distance. The quote most associated with Valeera, her statement that she respects her people and will make anyone who disrespects them pay the price, encapsulated her approach to identity. She was fiercely proud of being Sindore, would defend her people's honor against anyone who insulted them. But that pride did not translate into political loyalty to the Horde or submission to the authority of Silvermoon's leaders. She defined her relationship to her people on her own terms, not theirs. This approach to identity had broader implications for how we understand characters in the Warcraft universe. The faction conflict that had defined World of Warcraft since its launch had always included exceptions, characters who did not fit neatly into the categories of Horde and Alliance. Valeera was one of the most prominent of these exceptions, a character whose entire identity was built around refusing to be limited by factional boundaries. The question of whether such neutrality was possible, whether characters could truly stand apart from the conflicts that shaped their world, was one that Valeera's story explored in depth. Her friendship with Varian had survived the king's often intense hatred of the Horde. Her work for Anduin during the Fourth War had put her in the position of helping to communicate with those who opposed Sylvanas, even as her own people officially supported the war chief. At every turn, she had found ways to navigate between competing loyalties without abandoning any of them. The cost of this balancing act was not always visible, but it was real. Valeera had to maintain relationships on multiple sides of conflicts that were actively hostile to each other. She had to keep secrets from people she cared about, had to deceive some in order to serve others. The shadows that were her natural environment were not just physical but psychological, a constant state of operating between worlds that could never be fully reconciled. The rogue class itself, which Valeera represents in so many contexts, carries its own thematic significance in the Warcraft universe. Rogues are the shadows of society, the ones who operate outside the normal structures of power and authority. They include assassins and spies, thieves and scouts, saboteurs and infiltrators. They do the work that others cannot or will not do, accomplishing their objectives through stealth and cunning rather than brute force. Valeera embodies the rogue archetype perfectly. She has always operated in the spaces between, never fully visible, never fully understood. Her greatest victories have come not through direct confrontation, but through subtlety and misdirection, through appearing where she was not expected and striking when her enemies were vulnerable. The shadows are her natural element, and she has made them her home. The philosophy of the rogue extends beyond mere combat techniques. It is a way of seeing the world, a recognition that power takes many forms, and that the most obvious forms are not always the most effective. Valeera understands that a whispered word in the right ear can accomplish more than an army on the battlefield. That information is often more valuable than gold, that the ability to be unseen is its own kind of strength. This philosophy has shaped her approach to the conflicts she has witnessed and participated in. She has never tried to lead armies or command great forces. Instead, she has worked behind the scenes, influencing events through careful intervention rather than open action. Her contributions to Azeroth's history have often gone unrecognized precisely because she intended them to be invisible. The contrast between Valeera's shadowy methods and the more straightforward approaches of warriors like Varian illustrates the diversity of heroism in the Warcraft universe. Not all heroes stand in the light. Not all victories are won on the battlefield. Sometimes the most important work is done by those who never receive credit, who operate in the spaces that official histories do not record. The themes of trauma and resilience that run through Valeera's story resonate with broader human experiences. Many people have faced losses that seemed insurmountable, have been forced into situations they did not choose, have struggled with dependencies and vulnerabilities that threatened to consume them. Valeera's journey from traumatized orphan to influential figure offers a narrative of hope, a story that suggests that even the most difficult beginnings do not determine one's ultimate destination. The psychological realism of her character, despite the fantastical setting, contributes to her appeal. Her struggles with addiction, with trust, with identity, are recognizable human experiences wrapped in the trappings of blood elves and demons. When she fights against Cathrinator's influence, she is fighting against something that readers and players can understand, even if they have never faced literal demonic possession. The metaphor connects to real experiences of external forces trying to control and define us. The importance of chosen family, another theme in Valeera's story, similarly resonates with contemporary audiences. Many people build their most important relationships not with biological relatives, but with friends and companions who have proven their worth through shared experience. Valeera's bonds with Varian, Brawl, and Anduin exemplify this kind of chosen family, relationships that were forged through adversity and maintained through choice rather than obligation. As we look back on the complete story of Valeera Sanguinar, we see a character whose journey mirrors the themes that make World of Warcraft compelling. She experienced loss on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, watching her homeland destroyed and her family killed before she was old enough to truly understand what she was losing. She was enslaved, sold like property, forced to fight for the entertainment of others. She was possessed by a demon, her body and mind invaded by a creature of pure malevolence. Yet she survived all of these things. More than survived, she thrived. She built relationships that crossed the boundaries of race and faction. She earned the trust of kings and the respect of shadows. She found a purpose that was hers alone, serving causes she chose rather than causes imposed upon her. She became, in her own way, one of the most influential figures in Azerothian affairs, even as she remained in the shadows that were her natural home. The story of Valeera is not finished. The path to midnight awaits, with new challenges and new opportunities for her character to grow. The lands of Quel'Thalas, transformed since she fled them as a child, will present challenges both external and internal. The relationships she has built over the years will be tested by new circumstances. The balance she has maintained between factions will face new pressures. But whatever comes next, Valeera Sanguinar has proven that she can handle it. She is the survivor who became a champion, the slave who became a spy, the orphan who became part of a royal family. She is proud to be Sindore, proud to be a rogue, proud to be exactly who she is, regardless of what others expect her to be. The lessons embedded in Valeera's story extend beyond the boundaries of Azeroth. Her journey teaches us about the power of resilience, about the importance of maintaining one's identity in the face of pressure to conform, about the value of relationships built on genuine trust rather than institutional obligation. These are lessons that apply to our own lives, regardless of whether we have ever played World of Warcraft or encountered the Blood Elves of Quel'Thalas. Her example also speaks to the complexity of moral choices in a complicated world. Valeera has never been simply good or simply evil, has never fit neatly into the categories that stories often use to simplify their characters. She has made difficult choices, has accepted compromises that others might not have accepted, has operated in gray areas where the distinction between right and wrong was not always clear. Her story acknowledges that real moral complexity exists, that good people sometimes have to make hard choices. The enduring appeal of characters like Valeera lies in this complexity. Simple heroes who always do the right thing, and simple villains who are purely evil can be satisfying in their own way, but they do not reflect the world as we experience it. Characters who struggle, who face genuine dilemmas, who sometimes fail but keep trying despite those failures, resonate with audiences because they reflect our own experiences of trying to navigate a complicated world. The future of Valeera's story, whatever form it takes, will undoubtedly continue these themes. She will face new challenges, make new choices, form new relationships, and test old ones. The shadows that are her home will take her to places we cannot yet imagine, will present her with problems that have not yet been conceived. But through it all, she will remain essentially herself, a blood elf rogue who refuses to be defined by others' expectations, who gives her loyalty freely and does not apologize for the choices she has made. Her story reminds us that identity is not determined by circumstances, but by choices. That loyalty can transcend faction and race when it is given freely. That the shadows are not always places of darkness, but can also be places of protection and purpose. That surviving is only the beginning, and living is the real challenge. The world of Azeroth is vast and filled with stories waiting to be told. Characters like Valeera Sanguinar make that world come alive, give it depth and meaning beyond the mechanics of gameplay and the progression of raids. They remind us why we care about this fictional universe, why we return to it year after year, why the stories it tells continue to resonate with audiences across the world. Valeera's journey from orphaned street thief to trusted spy and champion of the shadows is one of the most compelling narratives in Warcraft lore. It spans decades of real-world time and millennia of fictional history. It touches on themes of loss and redemption, of identity and belonging, of loyalty and independence. It is a story that has grown alongside the game itself, evolving as World of Warcraft has evolved, deepening as the lore has deepened. For those who have followed her story from the beginning, from the first issues of the comic book to her latest appearances in the game, Valeera has become a friend. We have watched her struggle and triumph, have cheered her victories and mourned her losses, have come to care about her fate as if she were a real person rather than a fictional character. That emotional connection is the truest measure of a story's success, and by that measure, Valeera's story has succeeded magnificently. If you enjoyed this exploration of Valeera Sanguinar's story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales from the world of Azeroth. The history of Warcraft is filled with complex characters and epic struggles, and we look forward to sharing more of them with you. Sleep well, and may you find your own path through the shadows.